The train was 40 minutes late into Harrow Creek, which gave Evelyn Harper just enough time to consider getting back on it. She didn't. She stood on the platform with her two bags, one canvas, one leather, both worn at the seams, and watched the locomotive pull away in a cloud of gray smoke until it disappeared around the bend in the tracks. The smell of coal and hot metal hung in the air long after the sound was gone. Around her, a handful of other passengers dispersed quickly, folding themselves into waiting wagons or disappearing through doors with the ease of people who knew where they were going. Evelyn did not know where she was going. She had an address written on a folded piece of paper tucked into her coat pocket, and she had a name, Caleb Thornton, Blackstone Ranch, 7 miles northeast of Harrow Creek. And that was the sum total of what she knew about the life she was walking into. She was 34 years old. She had buried her husband 14 months ago, her savings 11 months ago, and her pride somewhere on the 3-day train ride out here, wedged between a sleeping salesman and a window that wouldn't close all the way. The wind had come through that gap the entire second night, and she'd sat rigid with her coat pulled tight around her shoulders, staring at her own reflection in the dark glass and thinking, this is what you chose. Now go through with it. The town of Harrow Creek was not what the letter had described. Caleb Thornton had written, in stiff, economical sentences that she'd read so many times she had them memorized, that the town was modest but growing, with a general store, a livery, a schoolhouse, and decent folks. What he had omitted was that the main street was mostly mud, that 2 of the storefronts had their windows boarded up, and that the decent folks were currently watching her from the front porch of the general store, with the frank, unself-conscious curiosity of people who didn't get many strangers. She picked up her bags and walked toward them anyway. There were 3 women and an older man with a white beard sitting in chairs outside the store. They watched her come without any pretense of not watching. "Excuse me," Evelyn said. "I'm looking for transportation to Blackstone Ranch. Is there a livery nearby that might hire out a wagon?" The white-bearded man tilted his head. Blackstone Ranch. It wasn't a question exactly, more like he was turning the words over to see what was underneath them. That's right. One of the women, middle-aged, sharp-faced, with a bonnet pulled low, looked her up and down with the kind of efficiency that took in everything at once. "You'd be the one he sent for, then." Evelyn had expected something like this. "I'm Evelyn Harper. Caleb Thornton and I have corresponded. We're to be married." Silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, more the silence of people who already have opinions and are deciding whether to share them. "How long you been traveling?" the man asked. 3 days? Come far?" "Pennsylvania." He nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd suspected. "Livery's 2 blocks down, other side of the street. Ask for Jesse. Tell him where you're headed. He'll set you up." "Thank you." She started to leave. Behind her, she heard the sharp-faced woman say something low to her companion. She couldn't make out the words, but she caught the tone well enough. Another one. That was the shape of it. Jesse at the livery was a teenager with an oversized hat and a gap-toothed grin. He loaded her bags into a small wagon without being asked and charged her 75 cents for the ride out, which was probably more than it should have cost. But she paid it without argument because she didn't know the rates and wasn't going to start her new life haggling with a 16-year-old. The ride took a little over an hour. The land out here was different from Pennsylvania. Flatter in some directions, more abrupt in others, the hills rising out of the plain without much warning. The grass was dry and golden with the approach of autumn, and the sky was the kind of blue that felt slightly too large, like it went on further than it was supposed to. Jessie didn't talk much, which suited her. She watched the land go past and thought about the letter she'd composed in her head a dozen times over the past 3 weeks. The one she'd been going to write to Caleb Thornton to cancel. "Dear Mr. Thornton, I have given this matter considerable thought and concluded that perhaps we are not well suited. Dear Mr. Thornton, I regret to inform you. Dear Mr. Thornton, I am not who you need." She had never written any of those letters. She wasn't sure if that was courage or cowardice. Maybe both. The ranch came into view over a low rise, a cluster of buildings that was larger than she'd expected, with a main house, a barn, 2 outbuildings, and a fenced yard where a half-dozen horses moved in the late afternoon light. The main house was 2 stories made of timber that had weathered to a dark gray, with a covered porch that wrapped around the front and one side. It looked solid. It looked tired. The fence along the front needed repair in 3 places she could see from the road. Jesse pulled the wagon up to the gate and stopped. He didn't explain why he stopped there rather than at the house. She climbed down, took her bags, and thanked him. He tipped his hat and turned the wagon around without waiting to see if anyone came out to greet her. She stood at the gate. The yard was quiet. Somewhere inside the barn, a horse moved in its stall. Smoke came from the chimney at the side of the house, thin, gray, smelling of wood, and something that might have been beans. Then the front door opened and a man stepped onto the porch. Caleb Thornton was taller than she'd imagined. She wasn't sure why she'd imagined anything specific, since he'd sent no photograph and she hadn't asked for one. He was somewhere around 40, lean and dark-haired, with a week's worth of beard that was closer to intentional neglect than any style. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the October chill, and he stood with his hands at his sides in the posture of someone who'd been interrupted. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked at her bags. "Miss Harper," he said. Not warmly, not coldly. The way you'd say the fence needs mending, a fact you were noting for later. "Mr. Thornton." She opened the gate herself. "It's good to finally meet you." He came down the porch steps to meet her halfway across the yard, and she could see as he got closer that he was tired. Not just today tired, but the kind of tired that had settled into his face and found places to live there. There were lines around his eyes that had nothing to do with squinting into the sun. He reached out and took the canvas bag from her hand, which she hadn't expected. It wasn't a chivalrous gesture. It was more automatic, the way you'd take a heavy thing from someone standing near you. "Long trip," he said. 3 days? "You look it." He said this without particular cruelty, just observation. "Claire's got something on the stove. Come in and eat." He turned and walked back toward the house. She followed him up the porch steps, through the front door, and into a room that stopped her mid-step. 7 children. She'd known there were 7. She had the number written in his letter in her memory. "I have 7 children ranging in age from 6 to 16. But knowing a number and walking into a room filled with 7 human faces, all of them turned toward you with varying degrees of hostility and curiosity, were different experiences. They were arranged, not intentionally, but it looked intentional, across the front room of the house. The youngest 2, clearly brothers, stood close together near the fireplace. A girl of about 10 sat on the stairs with her arms folded. 3 middle children were clustered near the kitchen doorway. And standing apart from all of them, near the window, was a girl who had to be the eldest, 16 or so, with her father's dark coloring and an expression that said she'd already decided how she felt about Evelyn Harper and wasn't open to revision. "Children," Caleb said with the practiced brevity of someone who'd been giving instructions for years, "this is Miss Harper. She'll be staying." No other introduction, no further context, just, "She'll be staying." Evelyn set down her leather bag and looked at the room. At the children, at the girl by the window who wasn't bothering to hide what she was feeling. "Hello," Evelyn said. "I'm glad to be here." The smallest boy, she'd later learn his name was Eli, stared at her with his thumb pressed against his lower lip. He had their father's eyes and the particular look of a 6-year-old who finds everything equally worthy of serious consideration. "Are you going to be our new mother?" he asked. The room shifted. She felt it. The specific kind of stillness that comes when a child says the thing everyone was thinking but no one was going to say. "I'm going to be your father's wife," Evelyn said. "What that makes me to the rest of you is something we can figure out as we go." Eli thought about this. "Okay," he said, apparently satisfied, and went back to whatever he'd been doing before she arrived. The eldest girl turned away from the window and walked out of the room without a word. Her name was Nora. Evelyn learned this later from the boy who introduced himself as Thomas, 14, with his father's height and his mother's freckles, she guessed, and the slightly exhausted manner of a kid who'd been functioning as a middle manager for too long. He provided the names in descending order: Nora, 16, Thomas, 14, Ada and Emmett, 12 and 11, Rosie, 9, Henry, 8, and Eli, 6. "Nora's upset," Thomas said matter-of-factly, as they stood in the kitchen while Evelyn helped set the table, or tried to. She wasn't sure where anything was, and the kitchen had a logic to it she hadn't yet decoded. "I understand that," Evelyn said. She was the one doing most of the, running things, after Mama. How long ago was that? 2 years last March. He paused. The fever. I'm sorry. He looked at her steadily, with a thoroughness that reminded her of how his father had looked at her in the yard, assessing, not hostile but not warm either, just trying to figure out what she actually was. You know how to cook? He asked. I do. Nora's better than Papa, but she's been doing it since she was 14, and I think she's tired. This was offered plainly, without complaint or performance. Just information, delivered with the quiet dignity of someone who'd been living inside a difficult situation for long enough that he'd stopped expecting it to be acknowledged. Evelyn set down the stack of plates she was holding and looked at him. Then I'll take it over, she said, and she can be 14 again for a while. Thomas blinked, like that wasn't what he'd expected. She won't like that either. Probably not. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The housekeeper's name was Mabel Greer, and she had been with the Thornton household for 11 years, through the births of several of the children, through Margaret Thornton's illness and death, and through the 2 years since, during which she had quietly assumed a level of authority over the house that she was not now inclined to surrender without cause. She was a short, substantial woman in her late 50s, with gray hair pulled back severely and hands that were always busy. She didn't say anything directly hostile to Evelyn on that first evening. She didn't have to. She simply worked around her, handing things across her, reaching past her, redirecting the children's questions about dinner to herself, in a way that made Evelyn's presence in the kitchen feel like an intrusion into a running system that had no slot for her. When Evelyn offered to stir the beans, Mabel said, I've got them, and moved the pot to the back of the stove. When Evelyn asked where the salt was, Mabel said, I've already seasoned them, in a tone that was not quite rude and did not quite invite further questions. When Evelyn asked, after supper, if she could help with the washing up, Mabel said, You must be tired from the trip, in a voice designed to sound considerate. Evelyn dried the dishes anyway, in silence, without asking permission a second time. Ooped. She slept that night in a room at the end of the upstairs hallway, not the main bedroom, which still had the particular quality of a space where someone had once been very present and was now very absent, and which Caleb still occupied alone. Her room was smaller, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the yard and the dark shapes of the outbuildings beyond. The quilt was worn but clean. There was a small dresser with a cracked mirror. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the crack in the mirror for a while. This was what she'd come to. A tired house, a closed man, 7 children who ranged from cautiously curious to openly hostile, a housekeeper who'd already decided she was temporary, and a town that had apparently watched other women arrive at Blackstone Ranch and leave again, which explained the particular texture of those looks on the store porch. Another one. That's what the woman had meant. She thought about Martin. Not in the sharp, specific way she'd thought about him in the first months after the accident, but in the way that had become more familiar. A general presence, like a shape in peripheral vision, more absence than image. Martin, who had laughed at everything, who had been careless with money and careful with her feelings, who had walked out one morning to check the mill equipment and not come back. 3 years of marriage, no children, and then nothing, an explosion, a collapse, a company that sent condolences and a small check and then sent lawyers when she tried to ask questions about the safety records. She'd spent the next year discovering what their finances actually looked like without his income, which was considerably worse than she'd realized. She'd taken in sewing, then boarders, then more sewing, and it had kept her housed, but not much more than that, and she was 34 with no family left close enough to count on. And when she'd seen the advertisement in the paper, Widower with children seeks capable woman of good character, correspondence welcomed, she had told herself she was only writing out of curiosity. She had written 7 letters before he'd written back. His response had been brief. He'd described the ranch, the children, his situation, with the dispassion of someone filing a report. He had not described himself, which she'd found somehow more honest than flattery would have been. At the end he'd written, I am not a man who makes promises easily, and I will not make them now. But I am serious about this arrangement if you are. She had written back, I am serious. And here she was. She got up, went to the window, and looked out at the dark yard. The wind had come up since sunset, moving through the grass in long waves she couldn't see but could sense in the sounds. The creak of the barn, the rattle of something loose on one of the outbuildings, the particular hush before each gust. She was not, she thought, under any illusions about what this was. It was an arrangement, a practical one. She would provide what the household needed: structure, care, another set of capable hands, and in exchange she would have stability, a place, a life that was not slowly diminishing. What she had not counted on was the weight of it, the actual weight of walking into someone else's grief and trying to make yourself useful inside it without being intrusive. The children's faces at dinner, Rosie, who had watched her with wide eyes and then looked quickly away whenever Evelyn noticed. Henry, who had eaten his beans mechanically, hunched over his plate. Eli, who had asked if she knew any stories and then fallen asleep at the table before she could answer. And Nora's empty chair. She hadn't come to supper. Caleb had said nothing about this. He'd sat at the head of the table and eaten his meal and answered Rosie's questions about the horses in short sentences and looked once at the empty chair with an expression that lasted less than a second before it was gone. After supper he had said, "I hope the room suits," and she'd said, "It's fine, thank you." And that was the full extent of their conversation as a nearly married couple on the first night of what was supposed to become a life together. She turned away from the window and began unpacking her bags. She had brought practical things: a good knife, her sewing kit, 3 books she'd had for years, a small tin of the dried herbs her mother had taught her to keep, thyme, yarrow, willow bark, a few others. A photograph of Martin, which she put face down in the drawer for now. Some things took time. She put the books on the dresser and got into bed. She lay on her back in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. The wind, the distant movement of the horses, the creak of floorboards from somewhere above, and then, lighter and less certain, a sound from the far end of the hall. Someone awake, walking softly. She listened until the sound stopped. Morning came gray and cold with clouds sitting low over the hills. Evelyn was in the kitchen before anyone else, having risen at 5 with the particular wakefulness that comes from sleeping badly in an unfamiliar place. She'd found where Mabel kept the coffee. A logical place, as it turned out. She'd guessed right on the second cabinet, and had a pot going before she began looking at what there was to work with. The kitchen was larger than her Pennsylvania kitchen, with a good iron stove and a long work table and a pantry off to one side. It was adequately stocked: dried beans, flour, salt pork, cornmeal, jars of preserved vegetables, a half-wheel of cheese. Not extravagant, but sufficient. She found eggs in a bowl near the back door. Collected yesterday, she guessed, and a paper-wrapped parcel that turned out to be a slab of bacon. She built up the fire in the stove and started breakfast. She was at the stove when Mabel appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:30, already dressed, her hair pinned back. They looked at each other. "You're up early," Mabel said. "I didn't sleep well." Evelyn turned back to the pan. "There's coffee." A pause. "I see that." Mabel poured herself a cup and stood at the far end of the kitchen counter, and they occupied the room together in the kind of silence that had specific texture to it. Not comfortable, but not yet hostile. Each of them aware of the other. "The children take their breakfast at 6:30, Mabel said. "Mr. Thornton at 6. "He's already been up," Evelyn said. "I heard him go out to the barn before I came downstairs." Mabel looked at her with a slight recalibration of her expression, not impressed, but noting that Evelyn had noticed. "He's always up early. I'll have his ready when he comes in." Another pause. "He likes his eggs fried, not runny." "Good to know." Mabel drank her coffee. Evelyn turned the bacon. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and meat, and, faintly, something better than it had smelled yesterday. Mabel noticed this too. Evelyn could tell by the way she looked around the room with the alertness of someone checking for changes. But she didn't comment. She set down her cup, said, "I'll see to the chickens," and went out. Caleb came in from the barn at 6:10. He was surprised, briefly, visibly, to find his breakfast ready on the table, but he said nothing about it, just sat down and ate. She'd fried the eggs the way Mabel had specified and made biscuits from the flour, and the bacon was in a cast-iron pan in the center of the table. He ate steadily and without ceremony. She sat across from him with her own coffee and the feeling of someone waiting to see if a thing was going to go a certain way. "The fence along the north pasture," she said eventually. "It looks like it needs work." He looked up. 3 sections. "I noticed from the road yesterday. Do you have the materials?" "Some?" He went back to eating. "Gets to it when I can." She nodded. Said nothing else for a moment. Then, "What time do the children need to leave for school?" 7:15. Nora takes the younger ones on the wagon. Thomas goes by horse. "All right." He looked up at her again. This time he held it a second longer, as though he was running some internal calculation she wasn't privy to. "You cooked all this yourself," he said, "while Mabel was out with the chickens. She told me you took your breakfast at 6. He said nothing to that, just picked up his biscuit, ate it, and put his fork down with the careful deliberateness of someone who was used to doing everything in the same order. "It's good," he said, which was apparently all that needed saying. She thought, "It's a start." Hassan. By the time the children came downstairs, the kitchen smelled aggressively of breakfast, and the table was set with more care than it had probably seen on a Tuesday morning in some time. Rosie and Henry came in first and stopped in the doorway the way children do when something unexpected is in front of them. "You made biscuits," Rosie said. "I did." "Mabel doesn't make biscuits on weekdays." "Well," Evelyn said, "I do." Eli appeared behind Rosie and pushed past her with the single-minded focus of a child who has identified biscuits and intends to have one. Thomas came in after, noted the table, and sat down without comment. Ada and Emmett arrived together and looked at each other with the specific eyebrow communication of twins or nearly twins, which in their case seemed to mean, "Is this okay?" "I don't know, is it?" They sat down. Nora did not appear. Caleb came to the kitchen doorway, looked at the table, and looked at Evelyn. She gave a small shake of her head. "Nora's not here." And he looked at the ceiling briefly in the way of a man calculating whether a problem is worth confronting now or later. He went to the stairs, called up, "Nora, breakfast," and came back. A few minutes later, Nora came down. She was wearing a plain blue dress with her dark hair tied back, and she moved through the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been the primary caretaker of this room for 2 years. She poured her own coffee, took her usual chair, and looked at the biscuits in the center of the table the way you look at something that has appeared where it wasn't before. "I usually handle breakfast," she said. Not to Evelyn specifically, more to the air. "I know," Evelyn said. "I was up early and wanted to help. I had it handled." "I know you did." Evelyn passed the biscuits toward her end of the table. "You've been handling it very well. I could tell from the state of the kitchen, everything's in its place. That doesn't happen by accident." Nora looked at the biscuits, then at Evelyn. She was trying to find the condescension in it. Evelyn could see her looking, and not quite finding it, which made her more suspicious, not less. She took a biscuit. She did not say thank you. "Thomas says you take the little ones to school," Evelyn said. "Yes." "What time do you need to leave?" 7:15. "I'll have everything cleaned up by then." Nora ate in silence. Across the table, Eli was methodically working through his second biscuit with the quiet concentration of a monk at prayer. Henry was watching Evelyn the way cats watch unfamiliar visitors, interested but prepared to flee. Only Rosie, who had apparently decided sometime between yesterday and this morning that Evelyn was going to be fine, was eating with the relaxed sociability of someone who felt at home. "Do you like horses?" Rosie asked. "I grew up around them," Evelyn said. "My father kept 3. "We have 11, Rosie said, in the satisfied tone of a child who has won a competition Evelyn didn't know they were having. "That's a lot of horses to know." "I know all their names. Do you want me to tell you?" "At breakfast is probably enough information for one morning," Caleb said from the end of the table. Rosie subsided, though not without a look that said she was tabling this for later. After the children left for school, the house fell into a different kind of quiet. The workday quiet. The kind with purpose to it. Mabel returned from the hen house with a basket of eggs and found Evelyn doing the dishes with the methodical focus of someone taking inventory at the same time. "I can do those," Mabel said. "I'm almost done." Evelyn kept washing. "Those eggs need to be counted. I'm trying to understand what we're working with in the pantry." Mabel set down her basket. "I know what we're working with." "I'm sure you do, but I don't yet." She rinsed the last pan and set it to dry. I'm not trying to step on your routines, Mrs. Greer. I just need to learn the house. Mabel looked at her with the specific assessment of someone who had watched two other women come through that front door and leave through it again, and was deciding how much of her time to invest in a third. You've had a household of your own before? Yes. 10 years, near enough. Children? A pause. No. Mabel absorbed this, said nothing, picked up her eggs, and went to count them. The week passed in the way of things that are harder than they look from the outside. There was no single moment of confrontation, no clear battle. It was subtler than that. The daily accumulation of small resistances and small accommodations, each one barely worth noting, and all of them together adding up to something exhausting. Mabel continued to treat her with the professional courtesy of someone who had decided to wait and see. The children were cautious in the particular way of children who have been disappointed before, and aren't going to let that happen again without a fight. Caleb was civil and distant in equal measure, present at meals, absent in every other sense, going about his work with the focused self-sufficiency of a man who had learned to need very little from the people around him. And Nora was the most complicated calculation in the house, and Evelyn knew it. At 16, she was old enough to have real authority, and young enough to be devastated by its loss. For 2 years, she'd been the person this household couldn't function without. The one who kept the kitchen running, who got the little ones dressed in the morning and bathed at night, who sat up with the sick ones and organized the school mornings and held the whole ragged enterprise together with the sheer determined competence of a girl who'd had no other choice. She'd done it all without anyone particularly asking her to or thanking her for it, because in a household operating at the edge of its capacity, that kind of thanklessness is just the way things are. And now Evelyn had walked in the front door and started doing the dishes. The confrontation, when it came, was quieter than Evelyn had expected. Thursday afternoon. She was at the kitchen table repairing a tear in Henry's school shirt. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house, and she'd gotten used to working there. When Nora came in from the yard, still in her coat, her hair windblown, she stopped when she saw Evelyn at the table. "That's Henry's shirt," she said. It tore at the elbow. "I found it in the mending basket." Nora crossed to the far side of the table and set down the carrots she'd pulled from the kitchen garden, then just stood there for a moment. "You're taking over everything," she said. Flat. Not particularly angry, more resigned. Evelyn set down the shirt and looked at her. "I'm trying to help. We didn't need help." And there it was. The break in the resignation, the real feeling underneath. "We were managing." "I know you were." "So why?" "Because you're 16, Evelyn said. Not harshly, just clearly. "And you've been running an adult's household for 2 years, and that's not fair, and it shouldn't have fallen to you." Nora looked at her. Her jaw was tight. "My mother—" "Your mother was your mother. She's not here, and you've been filling in for someone you can't replace, and no one should have expected you to." Evelyn picked up the shirt again. "I'm not here to replace her either. I know that's not possible. But I am here, and this," she nodded at the shirt, "is something I can do. Let me do it." Silence. "You don't know this house," Nora said, quieter now. "Not yet, but I'm learning." Another silence, longer this time. Nora picked up the carrots and took them to the sink and began washing them with sharp, efficient movements. "Eli likes his carrots cut in rounds," she said. "Not sticks. He won't eat sticks." "Good to know," Evelyn said. They worked in silence for a while after that. Not warmly, but something had shifted, however slightly. Yet, by the end of the first week, she had established a few small footholds. The kitchen was hers in the mornings, and Mabel had, without formally conceding anything, begun to step back from that territory. She'd repaired 6 items of children's clothing, reorganized the pantry by frequency of use rather than size, and started a bread baking routine that had the younger children appearing in the kitchen doorway on Thursday afternoon with the reliable interest of animals that have learned when feeding happens. She hadn't yet spoken to Caleb about anything that wasn't the household. She wasn't sure what there was to say. They circled each other in the house with the careful courtesy of people sharing a space they weren't sure they were allowed to make comfortable yet. At dinner, he was present but quiet, more father than anything else, watching the children, fielding their questions, making the small corrections and allowances that are the texture of parenthood. She watched him with them and thought, he loves them. He's exhausted and closed off and carrying something he doesn't know how to put down, but he loves them. What he thought of her, she genuinely couldn't tell. On Saturday evening, he knocked on the door of the sitting room where she was reading and said, "We should talk about the wedding." She set down her book. "All right." He sat in the chair across from her, not close, and said, "I was thinking the week after next, the circuit preacher comes through." "That's fine." He looked at his hands, then, "I want to be straight with you about what I'm expecting from this. Please, the ranch needs a steady pair of hands. The children need someone consistent. I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not able to offer you much more than that right now. I don't know that I have much more to give." She looked at him for a moment. "All right. I'm not trying to be unkind. I just think it's better if we both know where we are." "I appreciate that." She thought about how to say the next thing. "Can I be equally straight with you?" He met her eyes. "Go ahead." "I didn't come here expecting a love story, Mr. Thornton. I came here because I needed a place to be useful, and this place needs someone useful. If that's what we can be to each other for now, that's more than nothing." Something crossed his face. Too quick to name exactly, but she caught the edges of it, like something that had been braced against a certain kind of pressure and hadn't felt that pressure come. "Yes," he said. "That's fair." He stood. She thought he was going to leave, and then he didn't, just stood by the chair for a second as though there was something else, and he hadn't decided yet if it was worth saying. "The biscuits," he said. She blinked. "Pardon?" "The children. This morning Rosie asked if you'd make biscuits again. She asked me, not—" He stopped. "I just thought you should know." He left. She sat in the quiet room for a while after and thought about Rosie's face at breakfast, and the way Eli had looked at the biscuits like they were something that had returned after a long absence, and the fact that a 40-year-old man had come to tell her this not because he had to, but because he'd thought she should know. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. It wasn't much, but it wasn't nothing. The second week she began on the kitchen garden, which had been functional but not much more. She found where the good soil was and where it had gone thin, and turned compost into the beds in the afternoon while Henry and Rosie watched with the intense scrutiny of children who want to participate and haven't been asked yet. "Can we help?" Rosie asked finally. She'd been working up to it for 10 minutes. "You can," Evelyn said. "Here." She handed Rosie the smaller spade. "Dig down about this far. Like this." Henry watched Rosie do it with the caution of a boy who's interested but needs to see that it's safe first. Then he came forward. "Can I—" "Take this," Evelyn said, passing him a trowel. They worked for an hour in the thin October sunlight, the three of them, moving compost into beds that would rest over winter and be better for it in spring. Rosie talked constantly, Seth, about the horses, about her teacher at school, about something that had happened with Ada and a jar of jam that was apparently still a matter of great controversy. Henry was quieter, focused, doing the work carefully. At some point, Evelyn looked up and found Nora standing at the edge of the garden, watching. She didn't say anything. Nora didn't say anything. After a moment, Nora went back inside. That evening, after supper, Eli climbed onto the chair beside Evelyn in the sitting room. Not asked, not invited, just climbing up the way small children do, with the complete confidence of someone who has decided a space is available and they will use it, and said, "You said you know stories. I know a few. Tell one." Caleb looked up from his papers across the room, and Evelyn looked at him briefly, checking, she realized, for permission she didn't technically need to ask for. He looked back at her with an expression that was unreadable but not unfriendly. She told Eli a story. One her mother had told her, about a woman who built a house on a hillside where everyone said nothing would grow. She changed some of the details. The woman became a girl, the hillside became a prairie, and she told it the way her mother had told it, with the pauses in the right places and the voices slightly different from each other. When it was done, Eli said, "Again. Not tonight, but I'll tell you another tomorrow." He thought about this with the gravity of a contract negotiation. Then he nodded and went to find his father. Evelyn looked at the fire for a while. She had not expected to like it here. She'd expected to endure it, to find a livable arrangement in a place that needed her, to build something functional from nothing. She had not expected the specific weight of a 6-year-old climbing up beside her without asking. She had not expected to care whether Rosie finished her supper or whether Henry's shirt was mended right. She had not expected to look at Nora's careful, defended face across the kitchen and feel something that wasn't quite grief, but was in the same neighborhood, the sense of something that should have been easier being harder instead. She had not expected this place to become anything, but she thought, sitting there in the firelight, that it might. The wedding happened on a Thursday, 11 days after Evelyn arrived. It was not a large affair. The circuit preacher, a compact man named Aldrich, who smelled of horse and moved with the efficiency of someone who married people in between other destinations, performed the ceremony in the front room of the house. The children were arranged on one side of the room. Mabel stood near the kitchen doorway with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral. Caleb wore the same flannel shirt he wore every day, but he'd shaved, which counted for something. Evelyn wore her better dress. Gray wool, fitted at the waist, with small pearl buttons at the cuffs that had been her mother's. She had no flowers. She hadn't thought to arrange any, and no one had offered. The ceremony took 9 minutes. She knew because she'd watched the clock on the mantel. Aldrich said the words in the practiced tone of a man who had said them many times in many front rooms. Caleb said his part in a steady, level voice. Evelyn said hers the same way. Not because she was unmoved, but because the room was full of children watching her with the specific attention of people deciding something, and she thought whatever she felt was probably better kept to herself for now. Eli, from his position in the front row, watched the whole thing with his fists pressed against his chin and his brow furrowed with concentration. When it was done, he leaned over to Rosie and said, at a volume that was clearly meant to be a whisper and was not, "Is she our mother now?" Rosie shushed him. Rosie was 9 and had recently developed opinions about social decorum. Caleb signed the certificate. Evelyn signed the certificate. Aldrich took his fee, $5, pocketed it briskly, shook both their hands, nodded at the children, and was back in his wagon and gone within 20 minutes of arriving. Mabel made a cake. Evelyn hadn't known she was going to, and she thought it might have been the most unexpectedly generous thing Mabel had done since she arrived. It was a plain cake, not overly sweet, with a thin glaze on top. Practical, not festive, very much like Mabel herself. But the children ate it with real enthusiasm, and Rosie asked for a second piece, and even Nora ate hers without comment. After, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with his account book open in front of him, and Evelyn sat across from him with her mending, and they occupied the same space in silence for an hour, which felt, in its way, more honest than celebration would have. Aldrich comes through twice a year, Caleb said eventually, without looking up from the accounts. Marries people, settles disputes, does a baptism if you ask. That's efficient, she said. Out here you make do. She looked at him. The lamp on the table between them threw light at a low angle, catching the lines around his eyes, the roughness of his hands on the page. He was not a handsome man in any particular way, too weathered, too closed, the kind of face that had worked hard and showed it. But there was something in the set of his jaw that she'd started to read slowly, the way you read handwriting that isn't quite familiar yet. Thank you, she said, for the cake. I know that was Mabel, but I suspect you asked her. He was quiet for a second too long. Then, she suggested it herself. Did she? She did. He turned a page in the account book. Don't read too much into it. She bakes when she's working something out in her head. Evelyn almost smiled. What is she working out? You, probably. He said this without particular inflection. She'll come around or she won't. I can't make that happen. I'm not asking you to. He looked up at her briefly, then back down at the accounts. Go to bed, he said. You've been up since 5. She had, but she sat for a few more minutes anyway, because she was tired in a way that didn't translate to wanting to sleep. And the kitchen was warm, and the silence between them had settled into something that wasn't quite comfortable and wasn't quite uncomfortable, which was its own kind of progress. 3 weeks into her time at Blackstone Ranch, the town of Harrow Creek got its first real look at her. She'd ridden in with Caleb on a Saturday to collect supplies from the general store, a routine he did every 2 weeks, bringing in what was needed and settling accounts. She sat beside him on the wagon seat and watched the town come into focus from the road, noticing things she hadn't had time to notice when she'd arrived exhausted and disoriented, The schoolhouse was newer than the rest of the buildings, better kept. The livery had a hand-painted sign in careful letters. There were window boxes on two of the houses on the side street, empty now with the onset of autumn, but someone had bothered. The general store was run by a man named Horace Pelham, wide and slow-moving and sharp-eyed, who greeted Caleb with the comfortable ease of a long acquaintance and looked at Evelyn with the frank assessment she'd gotten used to from this town. "This would be your wife, then," Pelham said. "Evelyn," Caleb said. "Mrs. Thornton now." "Heard you got married." Pelham extended his hand to her across the counter. "Welcome to Harrow Creek, Mrs. Thornton. How are you finding it out at the ranch?" "It's a good place," she said. "I'm still learning it." 7 children, Pelham said, with a slight widening of the eyes that suggested he found this remarkable. "That's a full house." "It is." "Well," he slapped both hands on the counter. "Let's see what Caleb needs today." While Caleb went through the list with Pelham, Evelyn moved through the store with the purposeful attention of someone taking mental inventory. It was well stocked for a town this size. Fabric bolts along one wall, hardware along another, food staples in the center. She found the dried herbs section and checked what they carried, what they were out of, what was marked at prices that seemed high for the quality. She was looking at a bolt of heavy wool when she became aware that she wasn't alone. 2 women had come in while she was occupied and were now standing 3 feet away with the studied casualness of people who have come specifically to look at something and are pretending otherwise. "You must be the new Mrs. Thornton," said the taller of the 2, apparently deciding that pretense wasn't worth the effort. "I am." Evelyn turned. "Evelyn Harper, Thornton." The woman had a pleasant enough face, 40-ish, with a capable bearing that Evelyn had come to recognize as the universal posture of women who managed large amounts of work without assistance. "Ruth Daly, my husband runs the mill, and this is Frances Cook. Her husband's the school teacher." Frances Cook was younger, with an anxious quality that might have been natural or might have been specific to this interaction. "How are you settling in?" Ruth Daly asked. There was real curiosity in it, and something else. The particular interest of someone who had already been briefed and was checking the source against the report. "One day at a time," Evelyn said. "The Thornton household is—" "It's a lot," Frances said, with a hesitation that suggested she was editing herself. 7 children generally is. "They're good children," Ruth said with the firmness of someone correcting an impression she thinks might have been given. "Nora especially. She's been remarkable, what she took on after Margaret passed." "She has," Evelyn agreed. "She's still remarkable. I just try to make sure she doesn't have to be quite so much of it." Ruth Daly looked at her steadily. Something in her expression recalibrated. Not warmly, exactly, but with the considered respect of someone who's heard the right answer to a question they were testing. "If you need anything," she said, "in town, or anything you can't find at Pelham's, my door's generally open." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "I'll remember that." They moved on. Evelyn went back to looking at the wool. Behind her, she could hear Ruth Daly say something in a lowered voice to Frances Cook. She couldn't hear the words, but the tone was different from the women on the store porch on her first day. This was assessment, not dismissal. It wasn't much, but it was different. What she hadn't anticipated, what she couldn't have anticipated from the letters or the practicalities of the arrangement, was the sheer volume of feeling that lived inside this house. Not expressed feeling, not the kind you could point to and name. It was more ambient than that, like weather. The grief was still there, everywhere, in the specific way that Margaret Thornton's absence shaped the space where her presence should have been. The children had all found different ways to carry it. Rosie talked around it constantly, filling the quiet with chatter about things that were close enough to safe. Henry was silent in a way that wasn't natural for a boy his age. She'd watch him sometimes, working quietly at some task, and think, this child is holding his breath. Emmett and Ada covered each other's gaps, finishing each other's sentences, a closed circuit against a world that had already proved it could take things away. Thomas had absorbed it into competence, becoming capable and reliable in the way of someone who's decided that usefulness is safer than feeling. Eli, the youngest, seemed the least changed, or perhaps he had been young enough when his mother died that this was simply the world as he knew it, The grief less an absence and more a texture of ordinary things. And Nora. Nora had turned it into work. Pure, sustained, exhausting work. The house, the children, the meals, the mending, the schedules. She had made herself indispensable as a way of making herself safe. And now Evelyn was here and the work was being redistributed, and Nora had nothing to put her grief into, and it scared her. Evelyn understood this. She didn't know what to do about it, but she understood it. She started giving Nora specific things to teach her, not in a way that felt like charity, more in the way of genuine questions asked without condescension. Where does the good pasture grass start on the north side? How does your father prefer the horses brushed down? What's the trick to getting Eli's buttons done without a battle? Nora answered these questions with the brisk precision of someone who knows things and has usually been required to figure them out rather than being asked. But Evelyn watched her face when she was explaining something. The slight straightening of her posture, the shift from defended to authoritative, and thought, she just wants to matter here. She wants to be the one who knows things. So Evelyn let her be that. And she was careful not to let the letting be obvious. It was a balance she hadn't had to manage before, not with children, not with anyone exactly like this. She was learning it imperfectly, making missteps, stepping into Nora's space when she should have left it, backing off when she should have stayed. There was no clean formula. She made it up as she went and hoped that the mistakes were the fixable kind. The ones with Caleb were harder to fix. He was not a difficult man exactly. He was a contained one. He moved through the days of the ranch with a practical focus that left very little surface area for conversation that wasn't about horses or fence lines or what needed doing next. He was not unkind. He was not inattentive. He was simply not there in the ways that mattered for the thing they were supposed to be building. She'd catch glimpses sometimes. At dinner, watching Rosie perform some elaborate story about something that had happened at school. He'd listen with the particular quality of attention that adults give children when they're genuinely interested and not just being polite. A slight lean forward, a nearly smile. He was good at the small details of fathering. He remembered which child liked what, knew when Henry was having a bad day by something in the angle of his shoulders, knew when Eli needed to sleep before he'd admitted it. He was attentive to them in the way of a man who'd been paying close attention for a long time. To Evelyn, he was courteous. That was the most accurate word for it. He was courteous, and he moved around her in the house the way you move around furniture you've recently rearranged. Aware of it, not yet used to it, occasionally surprised when it was exactly where it was supposed to be. They had their first real argument on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks into the marriage. It started with the north fence. She'd been out to look at it more carefully. She'd taken to walking the property in the early morning before the children were up, learning the boundaries of the place the way you learn a new language, slowly and by making errors. The fence along the north pasture was worse than it had looked from the road. Not just the 3 broken sections she'd noticed first. There were 6 places where the posts were rotting at the base, and 2 of them looked like they were a hard wind away from coming down entirely. She mentioned this at breakfast. Caleb said, "I know about the fence." She said, "Those 2 sections near the creek look like they'll come down in the next big storm." "I know about the fence," he said again, quieter, in a way that meant stop. She should have stopped. "I walked it this morning. If those sections go, the horses—" Evelyn. The way he said her name, not loud, but with a kind of finality that landed like a weight. "I know about the fence. I've known about the fence since spring. There are 800 other things that also need doing, and I'm one man." The children were all looking at their plates. She said, "I wasn't suggesting otherwise. I was wondering if I could help." "You can't fix a fence. Probably not the posts, but I can do the rail sections if you'll show me where the materials are." Silence. She could feel the table's particular attention. 7 children who had never seen anyone argue with their father, or more likely, had never seen anyone continue after he'd deployed that tone of voice. "I'll look at it this week," he said, and went back to his eggs. She didn't push it further. But she was annoyed, and she stayed annoyed through the morning. The particular irritation of being told you don't know something you clearly do know, in a voice calibrated to close the conversation. She'd had that voice aimed at her before, in different rooms, in different forms, and she'd always let it close the conversation, and she was 34 years old and tired of that particular habit. That afternoon she found the materials herself, timber and wire in the smaller outbuilding, the tools hanging on a pegboard along the wall. She loaded what she could into the small handcart and took it to the north fence and started on the rail section she knew she could manage. She was working on the third one when Caleb appeared. He stood on the other side of the fence and looked at what she'd done. 2 completed sections, solid, with the nails driven straight, and then at her, and then at the work again. "You know how to do this," he said. "My father's farm had fences." She drove another nail. "I wasn't raised decorative." He was quiet for a moment. She kept working. Then she heard him go back toward the barn and come back, and he came around to her side of the fence with his own tools and started on the nearest post. They worked in silence for 2 hours. He was faster on the posts, heavier work, digging out the rot, resetting the concrete, and she kept pace with the rails. By the time the light started to change, they'd repaired 4 of the 6 problem sections, and the 2 remaining were marked with stakes so they'd know them in the morning. When they put the tools away, he said, "The other 2 tomorrow morning before the children are up." "All right," she said. He started back toward the house, then stopped. "I should have listened to you at breakfast." She looked at him. He wasn't facing her. He was looking at something on the fence line. "Yes," she said. "You should have." His mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, but something in that territory. He kept walking. The town's opinion of her shifted slowly, the way ground thaws. Not all at once, but in patches, and in some places not at all. Ruth Daly called at the ranch one Wednesday afternoon with a jar of preserves and a transparency of purpose that Evelyn found refreshing. She wasn't pretending to be in the neighborhood. There was no pretense. She'd come to see for herself how things were going, which was apparently the way Ruth Daly operated. She came in, looked at the kitchen, looked at the children's mending drying by the stove, looked at the bread Evelyn was in the middle of making, and sat down at the table with the settled authority of a woman who made herself comfortable wherever she went. "How are you actually doing?" she said. Not a question, more a specific kind of invitation. Evelyn set down the bread. "Some days better than others." "Mabel Greer giving you trouble?" "Mabel Greer is doing what anyone would do in her position." Ruth made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been skepticism. "She ran off the last one, you know, the one before you. Woman came out from Missouri. I think she lasted 3 weeks before Mabel made her life difficult enough that she left." Evelyn absorbed this. "How many have there been? Before you?" "2. Caleb tried after the first year, put out an advertisement, got a few responses. First one took one look at the house and the children and thought better of it before she'd even unpacked. Second one, the one from Missouri, got on well enough with the children but couldn't manage Mabel, and Mabel apparently made sure she knew it. Ruth folded her hands on the table. "You're the third." "I'm aware I'm not the first," Evelyn said. "I know you are. I'm telling you so you understand why the town figures you're temporary. It's not personal. They've just learned not to expect permanence from Blackstone Ranch in that particular regard." Evelyn looked at her. "And what do you think?" Ruth was quiet for a moment, looking at the kitchen, the mending, the bread dough resting under its cloth. "I think," she said carefully, "that the other 2 hadn't lost enough to know what they were giving up if they left. I think a woman who hasn't got much left to go back to tends to work harder for what's in front of her." She paused. "I'm not saying that to be unkind." "I know," Evelyn said. "You're not wrong either." Ruth nodded. "What do you need from town that you're not getting?" "More yarrow than Pelham stocks, a decent bone saw for the kitchen, and something to do about that section of road between here and the school. Thomas says it floods every year and the children have to go the long way." Ruth looked at her for a second. "The road's a matter for the county." "Then who do I talk to about the county?" Another pause, longer. Ruth Daly had the expression of someone who has arrived expecting one thing and encountered something slightly different. "My husband," she said, "sits on the county committee. Come to supper on Friday and I'll introduce you." "I'll ask Caleb." "Ask him. If he says no, come anyway." She stood, straightened her skirt. "The preserves are blackberry, from my own bushes. Don't tell Mabel I said so, but she oversweetens hers much." Mabel reached her own separate conclusion about Evelyn on a Friday in the middle of November, and it happened over something smaller than either of them would have predicted. Rosie came home from school that day with a tear in her dress that had been poorly repaired by one of the older girls using the wrong weight thread. Evelyn looked at it, looked at the thread, and went to her room for her own sewing kit. She sat down with Rosie in the kitchen, took out the bad repair, and redid it properly. The stitches even, the thread matched to the fabric weight, the seam pressed flat under her thumbnail when she was done. Mabel had come in partway through and watched from near the stove without commenting. When it was done and Rosie had gone off to change, Mabel said, "Where did you learn to stitch like that?" "My mother. She was a seamstress." Mabel was quiet. Then, "That child has been wearing that dress with that bad repair since September. I couldn't get the thread close enough to match." "It's a hard color to match," Evelyn said. "I happen to have something close." Another silence. Evelyn started putting her kit away. "I'll get the yarrow," Mabel said abruptly. "The next time I'm in town. I know someone who grows it, more than Pelham stocks." Evelyn looked up. Mabel was already back at the stove, her back very straight, her manner entirely matter of fact, as though she had not just offered the first unprompted kindness she'd extended since Evelyn's arrival. "Thank you," Evelyn said. She kept her voice the same as it always was. She did not make anything of the moment. That felt important. Henry was the quiet one, and quiet children worry her more than difficult ones. You know what you're dealing with a difficult one. She'd been watching Henry for weeks, trying to find the thread of him, and mostly what she found was this. He was a child who had shut a door on something and was standing on the other side of it, keeping it shut with both hands. He was 8. He had been 6 when his mother died. That was too young to process it, and old enough to know what was gone. And the combination had produced a boy who was careful, methodical, and almost never laughed. She started leaving things out for him. Not gifts, nothing that could be refused or found pathetic, just things she noticed he was interested in. She left her old naturalist's almanac on the kitchen table one afternoon when she'd seen him looking at beetles in the yard. She left the small sketch paper she'd brought from Pennsylvania out near the window where he liked to sit. She didn't mention any of it. She just made things available and let him find them. 2 weeks after she left the almanac, she found it back on the kitchen table with a dried beetle specimen tucked between 2 of the pages, pressed flat between wax paper with the careful intent of something deliberate. There was no note, but the placement, on top, where she'd find it first, was its own kind of message. "Henry," she said at dinner that evening, "is there more than one kind of ground beetle in the north pasture, or are they all the same?" He looked up. Something in his face moved. The kind of movement that happens when you've been quietly interested in something and someone finally notices. "3 kinds," he said. "I found 3 different ones. Maybe 4. I haven't decided about the 4th one yet." "What does it look like?" He told her, in more detail than she'd expected, with a specificity that suggested he'd been thinking about it for a while. Ada leaned over at one point and whispered something to Emmett, and Emmett whispered back. And Henry glanced at them and didn't stop talking. He talked until Eli interrupted to say he didn't care about beetles, which was a statement of opinion delivered with great confidence. And Henry said, "Nobody asked." And Eli said, "I'm just saying." And Ada said, "You're always just saying." And suddenly the table was alive in a way it hadn't been at the start of supper. Caleb at the end of the table looked at Henry and said, "4 kinds might be right. There used to be a pond in the northeast corner, drained years ago. Different beetles come to the damp spots there sometimes." Henry looked at his father with the expression of someone who has received information they will act on. "Can I look there tomorrow? After your chores?" "Yes, sir." Evelyn looked at her plate and felt something settle in her chest. It was not dramatic. No one else would have noticed it. But something had just happened at this table that needed to happen. And it had happened because she'd left an almanac on the kitchen table 2 weeks ago and let things move at their own pace. That was enough. That had to be enough. Bosmas. The first real snowfall came in late November. Not a dusting, but a proper snow. 6 inches overnight with more coming, the world outside the windows transformed into something clean and muffling. The children were out of school for 2 days. The house, which on ordinary days had enough room for everyone to find a corner, felt smaller with all 7 of them inside it at once. Evelyn made soup, the real kind, with a stock she'd been working on for 2 days from a ham bone she'd kept back from the weekend. It took most of the morning. The kitchen smelled of it through the house, and by noon the children had begun appearing in the kitchen in the way animals come closer to warmth in winter. Not asking for anything exactly, just being in the vicinity. Rosie sat at the kitchen table and made a card out of folded paper. Eli asked 4 separate times when lunch was going to be ready, receiving the same answer each time, until Evelyn put a small bowl of broth in front of him and said, "This is what patience costs when you spend it early," which he found deeply confusing and Rosie found hilarious. Nora came in at 11, stood at the edge of the kitchen for a moment, and said, "I can cut the bread." "Please," Evelyn said, and that was that. They worked alongside each other without friction, which was not the same as warmth, but was a different country than where they'd started. And the distance covered in 2 months had been longer than it might have looked from the outside. At lunch, all 9 of them were at the table, a thing that had not happened on a weekday since Evelyn arrived, usually because of school or work or the various logistical demands of a large household. The soup was good, not perfect. She'd oversalted it slightly, and the carrots were softer than she'd have liked, but good enough that the table was quiet for the first 5 minutes, in the particular way of people concentrating on food they're enjoying. Caleb said, "The old stew pot's been years since it's seen soup like this." It wasn't much of a compliment, but from him, delivered without particular effort or emphasis, just as an observation. It landed with more weight than an elaborate one might have. Rosie said, "It's better than Mabel's bean soup." Mabel was not at the table. She ate alone in her room by preference and had for years. Evelyn said, "Mabel's bean soup is very good," which was both diplomatic and true. "Yours is better," Rosie said with the implacable certainty of a 9-year-old who has eaten both. "Be that as it may," Evelyn said, "finish your bread." The snow came down outside the window, steady and indifferent, and the kitchen held its warmth against it. And for an hour or so, the fractured, awkward, uncertain household at Blackstone Ranch was just a family eating lunch in a snowstorm, which was ordinary, and ordinary was a thing this house had not had in a very long time. She thought about Margaret often, more than she'd expected to. She didn't know her, had never met her, had only the faint outline of her assembled from details. A fever, 2 years ago, in March. A woman who'd had 7 children in 18 years and run this house and kept these people together. The absence she'd left was not shapeless. It had contours. Evelyn could feel the contours in the children, in the specific ways each of them had folded around the empty space. She was careful not to try to fill it. That wasn't her job, and she knew it. Margaret Thornton had been their mother and would stay their mother regardless of who came after. Evelyn's job, the thing she was building, one day at a time, with imperfect tools and no instruction, was something different. A different shape. Adjacent, but not replacement. Some evenings, Caleb would sit in the front room after the children were in bed, not reading, not doing accounts, just sitting with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people carrying something they can't put down. She'd learned to recognize it. The slight forward lean, the way he'd look at a fixed point on the opposite wall. On those evenings, she tried to be present without being pressing. She'd bring her sewing or her reading and sit in the other chair and not demand anything from the silence. Once, late on a Thursday, he said, "She would have liked you, I think." Evelyn looked up. He wasn't looking at her, still looking at that point on the wall. Margaret. She didn't have patience for pretense. She liked people who worked without needing to be seen doing it. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. What was she like? He thought about it for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, she was funny, not on purpose. It just came out of her. She had strong opinions about things that didn't matter and soft ones about things that did. A pause. She had her mother's kitchen instinct. Better than mine. Better than most. He said it with the quietness of someone handling something breakable, and she listened with the care of someone who knows when to stay still. "She sounds like someone who was worth missing," Evelyn said. "Yes," he said. "She was, and that was all." The lamp burned. Outside, the November wind came around the corner of the house with that particular hollow sound it makes when there's snow underneath it. He stayed another 20 minutes and then went to bed, and Evelyn sat in the cooling room and felt the weight of the thing she was part of. Not only the work of it, the fence and the bread and the mending and the schedules, but the human weight of it. The grief that had soaked into the walls of this house and was still here, still damp, still asking something of everyone who lived inside it. She was not solving any of that. She knew better than to think she could. But she was here, and she was staying, and on the worst days that was the most useful thing she could offer. Her simple, stubborn, imperfect presence in a place that had learned to expect people to leave. She picked up her book. She read until the lamp needed oil, then she banked the fire for the night and went upstairs. Tomorrow there would be more to do. There always was. She was learning slowly that the list never got shorter, thus it just changed what was on it. That was not a discouraging thing, she'd decided. It was just the shape of a life that was actually being lived. She slept. December settled over Blackstone Ranch the way it settles over all working land in the Northern Territory. Without ceremony, without warning, just the slow accumulation of cold that one morning crosses a line and doesn't come back. The ground went hard. The horses needed extra feed. The children wore their coats in the house until the morning fire had been burning an hour. Evelyn had been at the ranch 10 weeks by then. 10 weeks was not long enough to belong to a place, but it was long enough to know it, to know which floorboards creaked and which window latch needed coaxing, to know that Caleb came in from the barn at 6:10 on most mornings and 6:40 on the ones where something had gone wrong overnight, to know that Eli talked in his sleep, that Henry could be drawn out with the right question, that Rosie's cheerfulness was not as effortless as it looked. 10 weeks was enough to understand the particular shape of this household's damage without yet knowing how much of it could be repaired. She had stopped counting days. She wasn't sure exactly when that happened, somewhere between the soup at the snow lunch and the Thursday night when Caleb had talked about Margaret. Some point where the mental ledger she'd been keeping, day 12, day 30, day 54, had simply stopped feeling necessary. She was here. She was in it. The counting was for people who were still deciding. The household had developed a rhythm that was not yet comfortable but was becoming familiar. Mornings were hers. The kitchen, breakfast, the children's preparation for school. Afternoons shifted depending on what the ranch needed. Fencing one day, the kitchen garden another, the children's mending the next. Evenings were the complicated part, the time when the house had to figure out how to be a household rather than a collection of people sharing a roof, and that figuring happened slowly, unevenly, with the occasional backslide into distance or silence. Nora was the barometer. On the days when Nora's posture in the kitchen was straight and less defended, when she passed things without being asked and answered questions without the fractional pause that meant she was deciding whether to bother. On those days, the whole household ran lighter. On the days she came downstairs with her jaw set and her eyes elsewhere, the children felt it, and the feeling moved through the rooms like a draft from a door left open. It was Nora who came to find her the night Eli got sick. It started like other things start, not dramatically, not with any signal that this one would be different. Eli had been quieter than usual at supper, which Evelyn had noticed but not flagged, because children are sometimes quiet at supper. He'd eaten less than normal and gone to bed without his customary negotiation about the story he was owed. She'd gone in and told one anyway, a short one, and he'd been asleep before the end of it, which also wasn't alarming on its own. He'd had a long day. He'd helped Thomas with the horses in the afternoon and come in tired and red-cheeked from the cold. She'd checked the fire in his room, pulled the blanket up to his chin, and gone to bed. At 2 a.m, a knock at her door. Not hard, urgent but controlled. The knock of someone who is scared and is managing it. She was up before she was fully awake. The instinct of a light sleeper already pulling her toward the door before she'd thought about what the sound meant. It was Nora, lamp in hand, in her nightgown with her dark hair loose and her face doing something complicated, fear underneath. And underneath that, the particular expression of someone who has been the adult in a crisis before and knows what it costs. "It's Eli," she said. "He's burning up." Evelyn didn't stop for her robe. She went down the hall to the boys' room with Nora close behind her, and she knew when she was still in the doorway that it was real. The heat coming off the boy in waves, visible in the flush of his face even in the low lamplight, the too quick rise and fall of his chest. She went to him and put her hand on his forehead, and felt her own chest do the specific thing it does when you touch a child with a fever that high, a kind of cold clarity, like something in you goes very still in order to be useful. "How long?" she said. "I don't know. I came to check on him an hour ago. He was already like this." "Did he complain of anything at supper? Throat, head, chest?" Nora thought. He said his head hurt. I thought he was trying to stay up later. Evelyn was already moving. Back to her room for the tin of dried herbs, back to the kitchen to get the fire going and water onto heat. She worked fast, but without the jangled inefficiency of panic, because panic was not useful right now, and she knew it, and knowing it was the only thing that kept it from happening. Nora followed her downstairs. Should I wake Papa? Yes, but tell him quietly. Don't wake the others if you can help it. Caleb was in the doorway of the kitchen 4 minutes later. He'd pulled on his clothes but not his boots, and his hair was still pushed sideways from sleep. He looked at the water heating on the stove, at Evelyn opening her herb tin, at the expression on Nora's face, and she saw it happen, the thing she'd been told about and had not yet witnessed. The way his face changed when illness entered the house. It was not panic, it was worse than panic in some ways. Panic moves, panic does things. What crossed Caleb's face was a kind of freezing, a going still that was connected to something so specific and so terrible that it bypassed the present entirely and went straight to the last time. 2 years ago, in March, a fever. A woman who had been his wife. His face held all of that in the space of a second, and then he pushed it back with visible effort. She watched him do it, and it was one of the harder things she'd ever watched a person do. How bad, he said. Bad enough. Not the worst I've seen. She kept her voice level. I need you to go sit with him. Keep him still. Keep the blanket on him. Talk to him if he's awake. I'll be up in a few minutes. What are you making? A compress for the fever and a tea if he can take it. Go. He went. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, heavy and fast, and then quieter as he reached the hallway. She turned back to the water. Nora was still in the kitchen, standing near the doorway with the lamp. What can I do? Stay near. I'll need you to hold the compress when I change it. And if any of the other children wake up, Thomas first, he can manage the younger ones. Don't let them into Eli's room yet. Nora nodded. Her hands were steady, which Evelyn noticed and was grateful for. Nora. She looked up from the herbs. You did exactly right coming to me. That was good judgment. Something shifted briefly in Nora's face. She absorbed the words and then set them aside, because right now was not the time for feelings, which was its own kind of maturity. Will he be all right? Evelyn didn't lie. She also didn't know. I'm going to do everything I can, she said. That's what I've got. The herbs were what her mother had taught her, and her mother's mother before that, a knowledge that didn't come from any doctor or any book, but from generations of women who lived far enough from both that they'd had to figure things out themselves. Yarrow for fever, willow bark for pain, thyme steeped long enough to make a tea that opened the airways and settled the chest. She'd carried the tin across 3 days on a train precisely because she'd known that out here, in a household of 7 children, the day would come when she needed what was in it. She made the compress first, cloth soaked in cool water with yarrow worked through it, and carried it upstairs with the tea steeping behind her. Caleb was sitting on the edge of Eli's bed. He'd lit the room's second lamp, and the boy was visible between them, cheeks furiously red, eyes half open and glassy, breathing fast and shallow. Caleb had his hand on the child's chest in the instinctive way of a parent checking that the breathing is still happening. He looked up when she came in. He woke up a few minutes ago, he said. Didn't make much sense. That's the fever. She went to the other side of the bed and laid the compress across Eli's forehead. The boy flinched and then stilled, and she held her hand lightly over the cloth, adjusting. Eli's eyes opened more fully. They found her with the unfocused search of someone trying to locate themselves. Evelyn, he said. Not a question, more a kind of recognition, like finding a landmark. I'm here, she said. My head hurts. I know. I'm going to give you something to drink that'll help. Can you sit up a little? Getting him sitting was a negotiation that required Caleb's arm behind his back and Evelyn's patience with a child who was too sick to cooperate and trying anyway. She got the tea into him in small sips. Not all of it. He couldn't manage all of it, but enough. She laid him back down, repositioned the compress, checked the blanket. How high do you think? Caleb said quietly from across the bed. High. I don't know the exact number, but high. She met his eyes. Children run hotter than adults. It's not automatically what it looks like. He heard what she was saying. It's not necessarily as bad as the last time. And she watched him decide to accept it, or at least to not argue with it yet. I'm going to stay, he said, until it breaks. I know you are. She pulled the chair from the corner of the room to the side of the bed. Then sit down. He sat. They positioned themselves on either side of Eli, Caleb with his elbows on his knees, watching the boy's face, Evelyn with the fresh compress ready and the tea keeping warm downstairs. The lamp burned between them. Outside the window, the December wind moved against the house with a flat, sustained sound. The first 2 hours were the hardest. The fever climbed before it did anything else. That was the way of fevers, she knew it, had seen it before. But knowing the pattern didn't make sitting through it easier. Eli moved in and out of something that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite waking, murmuring sometimes, pulling at the blankets, once reaching out with one hand and latching onto his father's arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong for a sick child. Caleb held the hand. He didn't say anything. He just held it. Nora came in twice to bring fresh, cool water for the compress and to check without asking. The second time she came, she looked at Eli for a longer moment than the first, and Evelyn caught her face in profile. The fear there, yes, but also something older and more complex. A 16-year-old girl who remembered the last time someone in this house had a fever. Go sleep if you can, Evelyn said quietly. I'll come get you if I need you. I won't sleep. Then go lie down. You don't have to be in this room to be helping. Nora went. Caleb didn't look at her when Nora left. He was watching Eli's face with the intense, blinkered focus of a man trying to hold something in place by watching it. He's going to be all right, he said. Not to her, more to himself. Or to the room, or to some private accounting he was running in his head. He might be, she said. We're doing what can be done. He looked at her then. In the lamplight, his face was stripped of the reserve it wore in the daytime. The particular control that was so much a part of him that she'd started to think of it as his natural expression. Right now he just looked tired and scared, which were old feelings on a new night. Last time, he said, and stopped. She waited. Last time I didn't know what to do. The doctor was 2 hours away and the weather was bad, and by the time... He stopped again. The muscles in his jaw worked. I felt useless. I sat there. And she got worse while I sat there feeling useless. You weren't useless, she said. A doctor 2 hours away in bad weather is a problem, not a character defect. I know that. His voice had a roughness in it she hadn't heard before. Knowing it doesn't help much at 2 a.m. No, she agreed. It doesn't. They sat in the silence after that. She changed the compress every 20 minutes, worked more tea into the boy when she could get it down him. The fire in the small room held steady. She'd built it up before she came, knowing the heat had to be controlled carefully, warm enough for the child but not stifling. At around 4 a.m, something shifted. It was subtle, the slight slackening of the tension in Eli's small body, the way his breathing evened out from the fast, shallow pattern into something slower, less labored. She noticed it first in her hands, which had been reading his temperature through the compress the way hands read things before the mind does. She pressed her palm gently to his forehead, and it was still hot, very hot. But it was different. The aggressive kind of heat had moved into something else. She looked up. Caleb was watching her. Something's changing, she said. Better or worse? She looked at Eli's face. The redness was still there, but the quality of it was different. His lips were dry, but not the blue-tinged color she'd been checking for. His chest moved. Better, she said. I think better, but it's not over. He let out a breath slowly. Not relief, too early for relief, but the small release of someone whose worst fear has stepped a half-pace back. Go tell Nora, she said. She's lying awake worrying. Tell her it looks like it might be moving. He hesitated, not wanting to leave the room. She understood it. I'll be here, she said. I'm not going anywhere. He went. Sat. By 5:30, the fever had broken. Not dramatically. Not in the way fevers break in stories with a sudden gasp and a miraculous recovery. It broke the way actual fevers break, slowly, with the sweat coming first, and then the gradual return of normal color to the child's face, And then Eli opening his eyes with the slightly bewildered expression of someone who has been somewhere difficult and has just found their way back. "I'm thirsty," he said. His voice was rough and small. "I know." She had water ready. She helped him drink it in slow sips. "How does your head feel?" He thought about it with the careful assessment of a child taking his own inventory. Still bad, but different bad. That's progress. Caleb had come back and was standing in the doorway. He'd been in and out for the last hour, unable to stay away, unable to stay still. Now he came to the bed and sat where he'd been sitting before and looked at his son's face in the growing gray light of the December morning coming through the window. "Hey," he said to Eli. "Hey," Eli said back, like they were greeting each other in the yard. Caleb's face did something that took a moment to recognize because she'd never seen it from him before. He bent his head forward so that his forehead rested against the side of Eli's, very lightly, and just stayed there for a moment, with his eyes closed and his hand on the boy's blanket. Eli, in the particular unself-consciousness of sick children, reached up and patted the side of his father's head, the way you'd pat something you were fond of and didn't need to explain. Evelyn looked at the window. She gave them the moment. The household woke slowly, in the way it wakes when something has happened overnight and the news is not yet certain. Thomas appeared first. He'd heard movement in the night and had lain awake, she suspected, doing what Thomas did with things he was worried about, which was hold them very carefully and not say anything. He stood in the doorway of Eli's room and looked at his brother, and when Evelyn said, "He's past the worst," something released in Thomas's shoulders that she hadn't realized had been up. "Okay," he said, and then, "Do I still go to school?" "Yes, but eat first." He went. Ada and Emmett she intercepted in the hallway and told them before they got to Eli's room. The news delivered clearly, the situation serious but improved. Emmett looked at the floor for a moment in the specific way of a boy who was feeling something and didn't have a mechanism for it yet. Ada put her hand on her brother's arm without looking at him, which was the kind of twin-specific comfort Evelyn had been watching these two provide each other for weeks. "He'll be home today," Evelyn said. "He needs rest. You can see him tonight." They went downstairs. She heard them talking in low voices on the stairs. Rosie was sitting at the top of the staircase in her nightgown, waiting. She'd been there for a while, Evelyn thought, long enough that the cold of the floorboards had come through. "Is Eli okay?" she said. Not even a question, just a breath. "He's going to be okay," Evelyn said. "He's sleeping now." Rosie let out a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a sigh, but was some honest combination of the two. Then she scrubbed her face with the back of her hand in the determined way of a 9-year-old who has decided not to cry about it. "I heard him in the night," she said. "I thought I should go, but I didn't know if—" "You made the right call staying out," Evelyn said. "There wasn't room in there for more people. You knew that." Rosie nodded. Then, "Were you scared?" Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "A little," she said. "Yes." Rosie absorbed this with the seriousness it deserved. "But you did it anyway." "That's what you do," Evelyn said. "Come downstairs. I'll make you something warm." By the time the school children had left and the house had quieted to its daytime configuration, Evelyn had been awake for 31 hours. She knew this because she'd looked at the clock on the mantel 3 times in the last hour, in the way you look at clocks when your body is starting to fail at maintaining forward motion. She was at the kitchen table with cold coffee and Eli's next dose of tea keeping warm at the back of the stove when Mabel came in from her room. Mabel had slept through most of the night's events, which was not negligence. She slept deeply, and her room was at the far end of the house. She'd found out from Thomas at breakfast, and she'd gone upstairs to look at Eli herself. And now she stood in the kitchen doorway looking at Evelyn with an expression that was doing several things at once. "You were up all night," Mabel said. "Most of it." Mabel went to the stove without further comment, added wood to the fire, and began making fresh coffee. She put biscuits together with the practiced speed of someone who has made them several thousand times. She didn't ask whether Evelyn wanted any of this. She just did it. It was not the same as what she'd done in that first week. The moving of pots, the reaching across, the smooth maneuvering that kept Evelyn on the outside of the kitchen's logic. This was different. This was just Mabel, making breakfast for someone who needed it, without any other subtext. "The yarrow," Mabel said, not turning around. "I picked it up from Hazel Pruitt 2 weeks ago. It's in the second shelf of the pantry." "I found it," Evelyn said. "I used some last night." "I thought you might. That's why I got more than the usual." She paused. "Your mother taught you, you said." "Yes. Mine too. Different things, though. More about the kitchen remedies." She put the biscuits in the oven. "The fever compress, that's a thing I used to do back in the first years, before the doctors started coming through regular. I'd almost forgotten it." There was something in this, the shared knowledge, the admission of it, that felt significant. Evelyn didn't try to make it larger than it was. She just said, "It works." "It does," Mabel said. The coffee was ready. Mabel poured 2 cups without being asked and set one in front of Evelyn and took the other to her usual spot at the counter. They drank in the kind of silence that has moved into a different category than the silence that was there before. Caleb slept for 4 hours in the mid-morning. Door to Eli's room opened so he'd hear if anything changed. Nora took the first watch sitting with her brother, and Evelyn took the second. By early afternoon, Eli was awake and coherent and demanding soup in a tone of voice that, given the night before, was frankly wonderful. "I can walk," he announced when Evelyn came in with the broth. "Not today." "I feel better." "You feel better because the fever broke," she said. "Your body still did a lot of work last night. You need to let it rest." He considered this with the focused pragmatism of a 6-year-old who is used to arguments being made at him. "What if I rest in the kitchen?" "Why the kitchen?" "Because it smells good in there." She looked at him. He looked back at her with absolute sincerity. She pulled the chair to the bedside and said, "I'll tell you a story. If you're still awake at the end of it, we can discuss the kitchen." "What kind of story?" "A good one." He thought about this. "Okay." She told him the story she'd been saving, the one about the boy who crossed a mountain in winter by following the path a fox had made, which was a story that had several parts and took longer than she usually ran with him because she usually stopped when he fell asleep. He lasted about 40 minutes before his eyes went heavy. She kept telling it past the point where she was sure he was asleep because the habit had never felt wasteful. When she came out of the room, she found Nora in the hallway, her back against the wall, arms folded across her chest. "He's out," Evelyn said. Nora nodded. They stood in the hallway in the gray afternoon light for a moment. There was something Nora was working up to. She could see the working in the girl's face, the calculation of whether to say it and how. "Last time," Nora said, "when Mama got sick, it was like nobody knew what to do. Papa went for the doctor and I was here with all of them and she kept getting worse and I didn't—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "I didn't know what to do. I was 14. And I kept thinking, if I knew more, if I just knew more, maybe—" "Nora," quietly, "you were 14 years old. I know that. Then you know that what happened to your mother was not a function of what you did or didn't know at 14. The girl's eyes were bright, but she didn't cry. She had a specific way of not crying that Evelyn recognized. The chin set at a certain angle, the eyes fixed at a deliberate distance. "You knew what to do last night," Nora said. "I knew some things. I got lucky on some others." "Stop doing that." Evelyn looked at her. "Doing what?" "Making it smaller than it is. You stayed up all night. You knew what to make and how. It worked." Nora unfolded her arms. Her hands were at her sides, open, in the posture of someone who has decided to say a thing completely. "I've been angry since you got here. You know that." "I know. It wasn't because I didn't—" She stopped, recalibrated. "I just didn't want to stop being the one they needed." "I know that too. And then you came in and started making biscuits and learning where everything was, and you were—" She made a frustrated gesture. "Good at it. You were just good at it from the start, and I didn't want you to be, because if you were, then I was—" She faltered. "Replaceable," Evelyn said, gently. Nora looked at her. Her eyes were doing the thing again. "Yes, you're not replaceable." Evelyn said this the same way she said everything, plainly, without performance. "I can make breakfast, and I can repair a fence, and I can keep a boy with a fever alive through the night, but I cannot be the person who has known these children their whole lives, who sat with them when they were sick before last night, who kept this household together out of nothing but love and a 16-year-old's sheer will for 2 years. She held the girl's gaze. That's yours, Nora. I'm not here to take it. The hallway was quiet. From downstairs came the small sounds of the house. Mabel in the kitchen, the pop of the fire, the wind against the east windows. Nora looked at the floor. When she looked up again, her face had done something, settled perhaps, or released something that had been held in it. He called your name, she said. Eli. Last night when he was half out of it, he said your name. Evelyn said nothing. I think, Nora started, stopped. Tried again with less precision and more honesty. I think that's okay. I think maybe it's supposed to be okay. The words cost her something. Evelyn could see what they'd cost, and she didn't minimize it. Thank you, she said, for telling me. Caleb found her in his kitchen that evening, standing at the window looking out at the dark yard. She was tired in the bone-deep way that doesn't show on the surface, and she'd been standing there long enough that she'd stopped seeing the yard and was just existing in the stillness of it. She heard him come in. She didn't turn. He stood beside her, not close, but in the same relative space, both of them looking out the same window at the same dark nothing. He ate half a bowl of soup, Caleb said. I know. I made it thin enough that it wouldn't fight him. He wants you to finish the story, the fox one. Tomorrow, she said, when he's stronger. Silence. Outside, the wind was doing the low, sustained thing across the flat ground. What would have happened, he said, if you hadn't known what to do? She thought about whether to answer honestly. She decided she owed him honesty. I don't know, a fever that high and a child that young, it needed to break when it did. Another few hours the wrong way. She let that sentence stop where it stopped. She heard him exhale beside her. And you had it. The stuff in the tin, the knowledge. You had it. I hoped I'd never need it, she said. I brought it because my mother told me to always bring it. I'm glad she told you. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the window still, but his profile in the lamplight had that stripped-back quality again. The one she'd seen in Eli's room at 3 in the morning when fear had taken the reserve off him. He looked older than 40 in this light, and also somehow not. Just a man. Just a man who had been very afraid and was on the other side of it now. I can't pay you back for last night, he said. I don't know how you would even... Stop, she said. Not harshly, just with enough weight to close that particular door. I didn't do it for payment. I did it because he's a small boy and he was sick and I know something about fevers. He turned to look at her. And because, she said more quietly, he's mine to care for. Whether or not either of us had planned on it going that way. The word she'd chosen, mine, sat in the air between them. She meant it. She hadn't planned to say it, but she meant it. And she held his gaze so he'd know she meant it. He looked at her for a moment. That was longer than a moment. Something worked through his face, complicated and not entirely readable. And then he said, Yeah, in a voice that was rougher than usual. Yeah, he is. He put a hand on her shoulder. A brief, clumsy, real contact. A man who doesn't easily touch people doing it anyway, because the night had been what it was. It lasted a second, and then he was past her and out the kitchen door to check on the horses for the night. And she stood at the window and felt the warmth of where his hand had been and thought about what was happening to her in this house. She had come here for practical reasons. She had come with very specific and honest intentions. A place to be needed, a life built on purpose rather than on feeling. She had not come for this. For the specific weight of 8-year-old Henry's almanac with the beetle inside it. For Rosie's questions about the horses. For a 16-year-old girl saying, I think it's supposed to be okay. For a man who could not easily reach out doing it anyway because the night had worn away the distance. She had not come for any of this. And she was in it anyway, all the way in it. The following days had the quality of aftermath, the particular texture of time immediately following something that could have gone the other way. Eli recovered with the speed that small children recover, dramatically fast, wanting to be up and running before he'd been still long enough. By the second morning, he was arguing for full reinstatement of his usual privileges. And by the third, he was so thoroughly himself that it was difficult to believe what the week had held. But the household had changed. Not in any way you could point to and name exactly. The furniture was in the same places, the routines were the same routines, Mabel still started the coffee, and Caleb still came in from the barn at 6:10. But something had reorganized itself quietly, the way things sometimes do after a crisis passes and you come back to ordinary life and find that ordinary life has moved while you were away. Nora came to her on Saturday morning with a torn hem that could have waited until Evelyn noticed it. She brought it herself, without being asked. She sat at the kitchen table while Evelyn worked the repair and told her, without particular prompting, about something that had happened at school the previous week, a disagreement with another girl that had been bothering her. She didn't ask for advice. She just talked, and Evelyn listened, and when she was done, she took the mended dress and said, "Thank you," without any of the freight it would have carried a month ago. The thing that could have taken a year to get to had taken a night. A night with a fever and a compress and a dark hallway where someone had finally said the thing they'd been carrying. It was not a resolution. Evelyn understood that clearly. Not yet, not in any complete sense. Nora was still 16 and still grieving and still working out what it meant to step back from a position she'd made her entire identity for 2 years. That was not a thing one conversation fixed. But the conversation had opened a door, and the door was staying open, and for now that was enough. Henry brought her a drawing that weekend. He left it on the kitchen table without announcement. A careful pencil sketch of a ground beetle, labeled in his precise small handwriting with 4 different parts named. Underneath, he'd written, "I think it's the 4th kind. I found it by the old pawn site. You can keep this if you want." She pinned it to the wall above the kitchen table in the blank space that had been there since she arrived. Nobody commented on it, but she noticed that Henry, at breakfast the next morning, looked at it once, quickly, with the expression of someone checking that a thing is where they left it. She was tired. She was still tired from the night of the fever in the way that takes more than a few days to clear. But she sat at the kitchen table in the December morning with her coffee and the smell of the fire and the sound of Eli upstairs conducting some business with Thomas that involved significant negotiation. She could hear the voices without the words. And she thought, this is what I'm part of. This particular, imperfect, difficult, real thing. Outside the kitchen window, the frost on the fence rails caught the early sun and held it for a moment before the warmth took it. The horses moved in the pasture, all 11 of them, as Rosie would be glad to confirm. The land lay cold and quiet and enormous in every direction. She picked up her coffee and held it in both hands and let herself be still for a minute. She had not saved the night alone. She'd had Nora's knock at the door, Caleb's arm behind the boy's back, Mabel's yarrow on the second shelf of the pantry. She'd had 30 years of her mother's instruction in a tin she'd been smart enough to pack. She'd had the fever's own decision to break when it did, which was not anything she'd controlled. But she'd been here. She'd stayed here and been here and known what she knew, and that had mattered. Outside, one of the horses, the big bay that Rosie called Copperton, moved to the fence line and stood there looking toward the house, just standing, steam from its breath in the cold air. Evelyn watched it for a while. Then she got up and started on breakfast. The week after Eli's fever had a quality to it that Evelyn didn't have a precise word for. Not relief exactly. Relief implies a return to how things were before, and things were not returning to how they were before. Something had shifted in the house's internal weather, and the shift was holding. Small things first. Rosie, who had always been friendly but kept her friendliness at a certain carefully managed distance, like someone who'd learned that warmth could be withdrawn without warning, started appearing at Evelyn's elbow in the mornings, not asking for anything in particular, just being nearby. She'd pull up her chair at the kitchen table and do her schoolwork while Evelyn was cooking, and she'd talk, which for Rosie was as natural as breathing, and the talking gradually stopped being directed at the room in general and started being directed at Evelyn specifically. About school, about Copperton the horse, about the ongoing situation with Ada's hair ribbon that had become a matter of sustained household diplomacy. Evelyn listened to all of it. She learned that listening was its own form of presence, not passive but active, the kind that required you to actually follow the thread and ask the right question at the right moment so the child knew you were in it with them. Henry's beetle drawing stayed on the wall above the kitchen table. He'd added to it since, left a second sheet one morning while she was out in the yard, this one a map of the northeastern corner of the property showing where he'd found each of the 4 beetle varieties. She added this to the wall beside the first one. Still no comment from him. Still that quick glance at breakfast to confirm it was there. These were not dramatic changes. The house did not transform overnight. What happened was quieter and more durable than transformation. It was the slow business of trust being extended by people who had learned to extend it carefully, in small amounts, checking at each step to make sure it was going to hold. Caleb changed too, though he would not have described it that way if asked. What changed was the distance. It didn't close, not entirely, not in the way that would have been too fast and too easy and ultimately false, but it shortened. He began speaking to her differently at meals, not more warmly exactly, but with the texture of someone talking to a person rather than a co-occupant. He'd ask what she thought about something involving the ranch, the feed supply for January, the state of the barn roof, whether the horses in the south pasture should be moved before the worst of winter. He asked these questions with the genuine interest of someone who expected a useful answer, not as a courtesy. She gave useful answers. She'd grown up on farmland, had watched her father work through problems with the particular patience of people who can't afford to panic, and she'd absorbed more than she'd realized she was absorbing. When she said the barn roof needed the east section shored up before the deep snow came, she wasn't guessing. He knew she wasn't guessing. They worked the ranch together with increasing efficiency, the unconscious coordination of people who have learned how the other moves. When she went to do a thing, she'd often find he'd already done the part that preceded it. When he came in from the field with a problem, she usually had thought about it already from a different angle. They had not discussed this coordination. It was simply accumulating, like the snow accumulating on the fence rails, layer by quiet layer. One evening, in the second week of December, he came in from a late check on the horses and found her at the kitchen table with the household accounts spread in front of her. She'd been going through them for an hour with the methodical attention of someone who had managed money carefully under difficult circumstances and knew where to look for the places a budget bled. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. "I hope this is all right. I found some things I wanted to show you." He came and sat across from her. He said nothing yet, just looked at the accounts the way you look at something you've been avoiding and someone has now placed directly in front of you. "The feed costs," she said. "You're paying Garfield's rate for the winter grain, but Pelham told me last month that Daly's Mills started carrying the same quality at 6 cents cheaper per hundredweight. Over a winter with 11 horses, that's a meaningful difference." He looked at the numbers. "Garfield and I have an account going back 12 years. "I know. I'm not saying break the account. I'm saying ask him to match the price. He likely will. He knows what it costs to lose a standing customer." He was quiet, reading the numbers the way he read things, all the way through before he said anything. "What else?" he said. She showed him 2 other places. The supply order that was buying more kerosene than they were using, which was getting old in the cans and burning less efficiently, and the standing order for flour that was larger than necessary now that she was managing the kitchen, since she baked differently than Mabel and used the stores at a different rate. He looked at the flour calculation for a moment. Then, "You tracked the usage by month." 3 months back from what the receipts showed me." He set down the papers. He looked at her with the specific attention he gave to things that had genuinely surprised him, which wasn't frequent and didn't look like conventional surprise. More a kind of stillness, like everything in him was paying attention at once. "I didn't expect this," he said. "The accounts?" "You." He said it plainly, without elaboration, as though it was self-explanatory. She didn't know what to do with that exactly. She gathered the papers into their order. "The accounts can wait until you have time to look at them properly. I just wanted to show you what I found." "No." He put his hand on the papers, not stopping her, just keeping them in place. "Let's go through it now." They spent an hour on the accounts. It was not romantic. It was not soft. It was 2 people sitting at a kitchen table at 9 in the evening, looking at numbers by lamplight and talking practically about what the ranch needed and what it was spending and where the gaps were. And somewhere in the middle of it, the particular quality of the space between them changed, became easier, became something she didn't have a name for yet, but recognized as real. When they were done, he said, "You should have access to the household accounts as a matter of course. I should have set that up when you first arrived." "It's done now," she said. "Still." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been running this place like a man alone. That's a habit. I'm working on it." She looked at him. "I know you are," she said. and meant it without softness and without edge. Just the plain fact of a thing she'd noticed. Odd. The daily supper happened on a Friday, 2 weeks after Eli's fever. Ruth had not rescinded the invitation despite the disruption of the intervening weeks, which told Evelyn something about Ruth Daly's particular brand of social intention. When she said she'd do a thing, she did it. The Daly house was larger than the ranch house and organized with the confidence of a woman who had been running a substantial household for 20 years and had long since stopped apologizing for having opinions about how it should be done. Evelyn liked her more the moment she walked through the door and saw the kitchen. Functional, not pretty, everything where it should be for the person doing the work rather than the person looking at it. Thomas Daly, Ruth's husband, was a compact man in his 50s with a surveyor's precise way of looking at things and a quick intelligence that he wore without ceremony. He shook Evelyn's hand with the same firmness he'd have given a business associate, which she found straightforwardly respectful. Frances Cook was there with her husband, a quiet man named Gerald, who taught mathematics and had the resigned air of someone who lived with Frances's anxiety and had made his peace with it years ago. Over supper, Thomas Daly asked Evelyn about Pennsylvania in the specific way of someone who has a reason to ask. He'd done survey work there in the 80s, knew the land. They talked about the geography for a while, and then the conversation moved to the territory and the county's road commission, which was where Evelyn had been trying to get. "The Blackstone Road flooding," she said when the opening came. "The section between the ranch and the school. Thomas, the boy, says it floods every spring and the children have to take the long way." Thomas Daly looked at her with the slight adjustment of someone who has shifted from social conversation to practical one. "That's been an issue since I've known the county. The grade on that section doesn't drain properly." "Can it be fixed?" "With a culvert and a regrade, yes. It's not complicated." He paused. "It's a matter of getting it on the commission's priority list. The road serves only a few properties." "It serves the school," Evelyn said. "The children from 4 ranches use that road to get to school on time. When it floods, they're late or they don't go." Thomas Daly looked at her steadily. Ruth, at the other end of the table, had the expression of someone watching something she'd been expecting. "The commission meets in February," Thomas said. "I know, Ruth told me." She held his gaze without making it a challenge. "I'm not asking for a favor. I'm making a case that the road serves an educational function that should qualify it for county funds. I can put it in writing if that helps." Gerald Cook, who had been quiet through most of the dinner, said, "It would help. The commission responds to written cases better than verbal ones. Something to do with the minutes." "Then I'll write one," Evelyn said. Caleb, who had been listening without contributing, reached for his water glass. He said nothing, but under the table his hand moved to her side of the space between them and rested there, briefly, before he withdrew it. Not a gesture for anyone else to see, just a thing between the two of them. On the ride home, the wagon moving through the cold dark, he said, "You didn't tell me you were going to do that." "I didn't know I was going to until I was in the room," she said. "Was that wrong?" He was quiet for a moment. "No. The road's been a problem for 5 years, and I haven't done anything about it because I didn't know who to talk to." "Now you do." "Now we do," he said. The distinction was deliberate. She heard it. She wrote the case for the County Road Commission the following week, sitting at the kitchen table after the children were in bed. It took 3 drafts. She was not a natural writer of formal documents, but she was a thorough one. And by the 3rd version, it was clear and specific and supported with the kind of detail that said this person knows what they're talking about. She cited the number of children affected, the frequency of the flooding, the educational impact, and the engineering solution Thomas Daly had described. She had Caleb read it. He read it twice. Then he said, "Change seems likely to qualify to qualifies. Don't soften the language." She changed it. He signed it alongside her name. When she looked at the 2 names, Caleb Thornton, Evelyn Thornton, written on the same page, she felt the specific strangeness of seeing her new name in a formal context for the first time. It was odd. Not bad. Just odd, the way new things are before they become normal. Nora read the letter too. Not because Evelyn had asked her to. She'd found it on the kitchen table while Evelyn was outside. She was sitting with it when Evelyn came back in. "This is good," Nora said. Matter of fact, like she'd expected less and was noting the gap. Thomas Daly thinks so too. He's agreed to present it to the commission. Nora set it down. She looked at the two signatures at the bottom. You're going to actually fix the road. We're going to try. Nora looked at the letter for another second, and then at Evelyn, with an expression that was neither the wariness of the early weeks nor the open door of the fever night hallway. It was something in between, something more settled than either. The face of a person who has made up their mind about something and is done reconsidering it. Ada's birthday is next week, she said. She'll be 13. She's been wanting a new hair ribbon. The blue kind, not the brown that Pelham carries. There's a dry goods in the next town that carries it. I was going to ask Papa, but... She stopped. I'm asking you. Evelyn looked at her. I'll get to town on Thursday. What shade of blue? She'll say any shade, but she actually wants the darker one. The one that's more like ink than sky. Ink blue. All right. Nora nodded. She took her coat from the hook by the door and went out to help Thomas with the afternoon horses, and Evelyn stood in the kitchen and let the moment settle into its proper size, which was not small. Ada's birthday fell on a Wednesday. Evelyn had the ink blue ribbon wrapped in paper on the breakfast table beside Ada's plate when she came downstairs, and Ada's face when she unwrapped it, the quick intake of breath, the color in her cheeks, was one of those moments that happen fast and stay a long time. How did you know? Ada said. She was looking at Evelyn, not the ribbon. Someone told me, Evelyn said. Ada looked at Nora across the table. Nora was eating her biscuit with a studied casualness that was its own kind of admission. Ada reached over and squeezed her sister's arm without saying anything, and Nora let it happen, which for Nora was approximately the equivalent of a speech. Caleb watched this from the end of the table with the expression of a man who is watching something he'd begun to stop expecting and is not entirely sure how to account for it. That afternoon, after school, all 7 children were in the yard in the thin winter sun. Some argument about something that required the full legislative body. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window. Eli, fully recovered and characteristically undeterred by any awareness of his recent near miss with serious illness, was making his case for something with the complete certainty of a 6-year-old who has never once considered that he might be wrong. Thomas had his arms folded and his patient face on. Rosie was nominally playing peacemaker, but mostly making things more complicated. Ada and Emmett were a unit, as always. Henry stood slightly apart, listening, which was his natural position in any group discussion. And Nora was there, not managing them, not running the operation with the compressed efficiency of a teenager who has no choice. Just there, talking to Emmett about something on the side while the main argument ran. Her posture was different, looser. Something she'd been holding for a long time had been set down, and the absence of the weight was visible in the way she stood. Caleb came to stand beside Evelyn at the window. He looked at the yard. "She's laughing," he said. He said it quietly, not to anyone in particular, just noting something. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the argument reached some resolution that involved Eli sitting down suddenly with an expression of profound satisfaction, which meant he'd gotten what he wanted. Thomas looked at the sky in the manner of someone requesting patience from the universe. "I can't remember the last time I heard her laugh like that," Caleb said. "Before Margaret, she was different, younger. After..." He stopped. "She's been carrying something that wasn't hers to carry." "I know," Evelyn said. "She's putting it down." He turned to look at her. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and sat on the side of his face, and he looked, in that moment, less defended than she'd ever seen him in ordinary daylight. None of the careful management, none of the calibrated distance. Just a man standing in his kitchen watching his daughter laugh for the first time in a long time. "You did that," he said. "She did it," Evelyn said. "I just made room for it." He shook his head slightly, the way you shake your head at something you think is being undersold. But he didn't push it. They stood at the window together for another minute, watching the yard, and the particular quality of standing beside someone without needing to fill the space was something she'd stopped noticing because it had become so ordinary. She thought about that, about how quickly ordinary arrived, when it was going to be the real kind. The thing with Mabel happened simply, as things do when they've been approaching slowly for a long time. It was a Thursday afternoon. Evelyn was making bread. Mabel was at the table mending, which was a thing she'd started doing in the kitchen more often in the weeks since the fever, moving toward the kitchen rather than away from it, which was its own form of statement. They worked in the room together with the ease of people who have negotiated the terms of a shared space and are no longer negotiating. Mabel said, out of nowhere, the way she said most important things, "You're staying." Evelyn glanced up. Yes. The others didn't. She said this without judgment, the one from Missouri especially. I know it said I made things difficult for her. Ruth Daly mentioned it. Mabel's mouth pressed briefly together. Ruth Daly talks. She does, but she's not wrong about most things. Mabel was quiet for a moment. Her needle moved steadily through the fabric. I wasn't trying to run her off, she said. I was trying to see what she was made of, whether she'd stand or whether she'd fold. She looked up. She folded. I didn't fold, Evelyn said. No, Mabel said. You didn't. A pause. You're different from what I expected. From the advertisement, from what I thought. She stopped. I thought you'd be desperate, looking for safety, using this place. I was looking for safety, Evelyn said. I don't think that's different from what you thought. No, but Mabel set down her mending. This apparently required her full attention. Safety for yourself and working yourself to the bone for a house full of other people's children are different things. People who are just using a place don't do what you did with Eli. Don't get up at 2 a.m. for a child that isn't theirs. Evelyn turned back to the bread. Her hands pressed into the dough. He is mine, she said. They all are. I didn't plan it that way, but that's what happened. Mabel looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her mending and resumed the steady work of her needle. I'll say this once and not again, she said. You're good for this house. You're good for him. The him was Caleb. Undeniable, though she didn't name him. He's been running on empty for 2 years and he's eating properly. He's sleeping. Some of that is you. Evelyn said nothing. She knew better than to make more of Mabel's acknowledgments than Mabel intended them to carry. The ginger preserves in the pantry, Mabel said, returning to a practical register with obvious relief. Those are from 3 seasons back and need to be used or thrown. I thought you might find a use for them in the Christmas baking. I will, Evelyn said. Thank you. Don't make a thing of it. I'm not. They went back to work. The kitchen held its warmth. The bread smelled of yeast and the particular comfort of something rising. And outside the window, the winter light was fading early the way it does in December, turning the frost on the fence rails gold for a few minutes before it went gray. What? Christmas that year was the first one Evelyn was part of. She had not been part of a Christmas in 3 years. The last one with Martin had been a small thing, just the 2 of them, in the year before the accident, and the 2 after that had been the kind of Christmases you survive rather than experience. She had forgotten, somewhere in those 2 years of surviving, that the holiday had weight to it, that it carried things. She discovered this on Christmas Eve, when she found Caleb in the sitting room after the children were in bed, sitting in the chair near the window with the particular stillness she associated with his hardest nights. She came and sat in the other chair without asking and without speaking, and they sat together in the dark and the firelight for a while. Eventually he said, "First Christmas without her was the worst. Second one I thought would be easier. It wasn't." "Does it get easier?" "Different," he said. "Not easier. Different." She thought about Martin, about the Christmas in that year before, the 2 of them laughing about something at the kitchen table, the specific sound of his laugh that she could still locate somewhere in her memory but couldn't quite hear anymore. The way grief worked on memory, like weather on stone, wearing the edges first. "I know different," she said. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "I know you do." They sat for a while longer. Then he said, "The children did something. While I was out with the horses this afternoon, I think Nora organized it." He was quiet. "There's something on the mantel. Don't tell them I told you." She looked at the mantel. She hadn't noticed in the low light. There was a line of small shapes, unevenly spaced. She got up to look. 7 small items. A pine cone, a piece of ribbon, a pressed wildflower that was almost certainly from Henry's collection, a smooth river stone, 2 small drawings, and a folded paper that turned out to be a note in Eli's printing that said in large letters, Thank you for the stories. Eli T. She stood at the mantel for a moment. She was not going to cry about this. She was going to look at it and absorb it and put it where it belonged, which was in the category of things she would carry. She turned back. Caleb was watching her. Eli spelled stories wrong, she said. He spells most things wrong, Caleb said. He's 6. I know. She came back and sat down. I'm going to keep the note. I figured. They stayed by the fire until late, not talking much, just occupying the same space in the particular way that had become their version of closeness, which was quiet and imperfect and real. Eventually, she said goodnight and went upstairs, and she lay in her room listening to the house settle in the cold, and thought about the mantle and the note and the ink blue ribbon and a girl laughing in the yard, and the long distance between the woman who had stood at the gate with 2 bags and this woman, in this bed, in this house, that was becoming hers. Not because she had taken it, because she had stayed. There was a difference, and it mattered, and she held it for a while before she slept. January came in hard, the way January does in that part of the territory. Cold that had teeth to it, wind that found the gaps in the barn walls, and the places where the house hadn't been properly chinked in years. Evelyn spent the first week of the new year going through the house with a methodical attention to draft and warmth, stuffing gaps with rags and horsehair where the material held, making a list of the places that needed proper repair come spring. Caleb watched her do this without comment for 2 days, and then on the 3rd day picked up her list, read it, and added 4 items she'd missed on the north side of the house. She didn't remark on this. She just noted the additions and moved on. That was the rhythm they'd settled into by January. So, not dramatic, not soft, but real. A working partnership between 2 people who'd been through enough together that the pretense of distance no longer served either of them. They talked about the ranch the way people talk about something they share, with the specific shorthand that develops between people who have been paying attention to the same thing from different angles for long enough. The road petition went to the county commission in February, as Thomas Daly had promised. Evelyn wasn't there. The meeting was in the county seat, a day's ride, and she had 7 children and a ranch to manage. Daly went. He came back with the news that the commission had approved the culvert work for the spring thaw, funded through the educational access budget, which was apparently a line item that rarely got used because most people didn't know it existed. Caleb told her at dinner. He said it plainly, the way he said most things. The children were at the table and they heard it, and Thomas, the boy, not Daly, looked up from his plate with an expression that moved between surprise and something else, something that took a moment to name. It was the look of a young man realizing that things he'd accepted as permanent could be changed if someone just talked to the right person in the right language. The road's getting fixed, he said. By April, they said, before the worst of the melt. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been going the long way for 3 years. I know, Evelyn said. You wrote a letter and it's fixed. Thomas Daly presented it. The commission voted for it. It took several people. But you started it. She didn't argue with this. She passed the bread. Rosie said, Does that mean we won't be late to school anymore? If it works the way they say, Evelyn said. Yes. Rosie turned to Eli with the decisive energy of someone closing an argument. See, I told you she could fix the road. Eli, who apparently had no memory of this exchange, said, I didn't say she couldn't. You said roads don't get fixed. I said that road doesn't get fixed. I didn't say she couldn't. Caleb caught Evelyn's eye across the table. She looked back at him. He had the expression she'd come to recognize as the closest he came to finding something funny at the dinner table. A slight softening around the eyes, a press of the lips that was almost a smile and wasn't quite. It was a small moment. It was also exactly what 4 months of careful, imperfect work looked like when it was functioning. The question of belonging, what it means, how it's made, whether it can be made at all or only arrived at, was something Evelyn had thought about since well before she came to Blackstone Ranch. She'd thought about it after Martin died, when she'd discovered that much of what she'd called her life had been organized around him and his without her quite noticing. She'd thought about it on the train out here, watching the land change through that window with the gap that let the cold in. She had not expected to find an answer at a kitchen table in the middle of a frontier winter, but she was finding something, and it was closer to an answer than anything she'd encountered before. Belonging, she was learning, was not given. It was not a thing you received from a place or a people. It was built, slowly, repetitively, often without any guarantee that the building was going anywhere. It was made of mornings where you got up and did the thing that needed doing even when you were tired and uncertain. It was made of the willingness to stay in a room when leaving would have been easier, of asking a 16-year-old girl the right question at the right time, and then listening to the answer without trying to fix it, of knowing where the yarrow was on the second shelf of the pantry. These things added up. They added up slowly, and the math of them was not always visible while you were doing it. But one day you looked at the kitchen wall and there was a beetle drawing pinned above the table, and a boy who hadn't laughed in a year was arguing with his sister at dinner, and a girl who'd been holding a household together alone for 2 years was standing in the yard with her posture loose and her voice easy. And you understood that the adding up had been happening the whole time, even when you couldn't see it. That was what she thought about on an afternoon in late February, standing in the yard while the first edge of the season's change moved through the air, still cold, still winter, but different. Something had shifted in the quality of the light. Nora came to her in March with something she'd been working up to for a while. Evelyn could tell by the way she appeared in the kitchen doorway on a Sunday afternoon when she'd usually be with Ada. The deliberate nature of the arrival, the way she was holding herself. "I want to be a teacher," Nora said, straight out the way she did things once she'd decided to do them. "I've been thinking about it for a long time, since before—" She stopped. "Since before Mama. But then everything happened, and there wasn't a way to think about it. There wasn't room." Evelyn set down the jar she was working with. She gave Nora the full attention the moment warranted. "What kind of teacher?" "Like Mr. Cook, the schoolhouse kind. I'm good with the younger ones. I know I am. I've been doing it for years." She paused. "I know it costs money, training, and then waiting for a position. I'm not asking you to—" "Gerald Cook," Evelyn said, "is planning to retire in 2 years. Ruth Daly told me in January." Nora blinked. "He is?" "He said so to the school board. They'll need someone." She looked at the girls steadily. "You're 16. 2 years is enough time to complete the county teaching examination if you start preparing now. Frances Cook tutors for it. I can ask her." Nora stared at her. The careful neutrality she still sometimes deployed slipped, and underneath it was a 17-year-old's face that wanted something so directly it hadn't figured out how to want it quietly yet. "You'd do that," Nora said. "Just like that." "I'd ask Frances. What she says is up to her." Evelyn picked up the jar again. "But yes, just like that." "Why?" The question was genuine, no challenge in it, just the honest bewilderment of a young person who has been told so many times that the things they want are complicated or expensive or inconvenient that a simple yes reads as suspicious. Evelyn thought about how to answer this honestly. "Because you're smart, and you're capable, and the last 2 years you've spent your intelligence keeping this household alive, which was necessary and was also a waste of what you could be doing with it." She looked at Nora. "You shouldn't have to shrink yourself for this family. None of you should." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Papa, your father will agree," Evelyn said. She said it with the certainty of someone who had been watching Caleb Thornton for 4 months and understood him well enough to know where his limits were and where they weren't. "He wants you to have a life, Nora. He just needed someone to say it out loud." She talked to Caleb that night. He was quiet through most of it, which was how he processed things. When she finished, he said, "She's 16. Almost 17. Teaching's a hard life. It's her life to pick." He looked at the fire. She let him think. He said, "Frances Cook would tutor her?" "I'll ask Monday." Another silence. "It costs money, the examination prep." "Less than another season of fence wire," Evelyn said, "and better spent." He almost smiled. Almost. "All right," he said, "talk to Frances." She did on Monday. Frances Cook had a particular kind of joy about it, the joy of a naturally anxious person who has found exactly the right thing to be anxious about, which was making sure Nora was adequately prepared. She took the tutoring on as though it was a mission. When Evelyn told Nora, the girl sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you," in the voice of someone for whom those words were carrying a lot of other words behind them. "Thank your father," Evelyn said. "He said yes." Nora found him in this barn that afternoon. Evelyn didn't know what was said between them. She didn't ask, and neither of them told her. But Nora came back from the barn with her eyes bright and the kind of expression that takes up residence in a face when something has been settled that needed settling. And Caleb came to supper that evening with a slightly less careful look about him, like something he'd been worrying about had been resolved in the way he'd hoped. The road crew came in April, as promised. 6 men and a mule team and a wagon full of pipe and gravel, and they worked the flooding section of the road for 4 days while the children watched from the fence line on the way to school, and Evelyn watched from the house with something she could only call satisfaction. Thomas Daly rode out on the 3rd day and stood with Evelyn at the edge of the property, looking at the work in progress. "The grade's not perfect," he said, with the surveyor's eye for imprecision. "But it'll do the job." "It'll do the job," she agreed. "That's enough." He looked at her sideways. He'd developed, over the winter, a kind of straightforward respect for her that expressed itself in his willingness to have practical conversations without prologue. "You're sticking around," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." "Good," he said. "The county needs people who ask questions and know which ones to ask." He turned to go back to his horse. "Ruth wants you both for supper when the planting starts. She'll send word." "We'll come," Evelyn said. Harrow Creek had not become a warm town. It was not a warm town by nature, and 4 months hadn't changed its fundamental character. But the specific quality of its attention toward Evelyn had changed. The looks on the store porch were different now. Not friendly exactly, but different. The difference between people assessing an unknown quantity and people who have made up their minds. Pelham at the general store had started setting aside the good yarrow when he got it in, without being asked, and leaving it behind the counter with her name on it. This was, in the language of Harrow Creek, a significant gesture. The sharp-faced woman, whose name turned out to be Clara Brandt, stopped her on the street in late March and said without preamble, "I heard you wrote the letter about the school road." "Yes," Evelyn said. Clara Brandt looked at her for a moment. "My youngest has been going the long way for 4 years," she said. "I never thought about writing a letter." She said this without self-reproach, just as a fact. Then she nodded once and went into the dry goods, and that was the extent of it. It was enough, more than enough. Spring came in fits and starts, the way spring does in difficult territory. Some days warm enough to smell the thaw in the ground, others cold enough to remind you that winter hadn't fully conceded. The kitchen garden came back with the particular tenacity of things that have been properly put to bed. Evelyn worked it in the early mornings, and Rosie and Eli worked it with her with varying degrees of helpfulness and a great deal of commentary. Henry's beetle survey expanded. He'd started a proper notebook, brown cover, his name written carefully on the front, in which he recorded his observations with a precision that made Gerald Cook, when he happened to see it at supper one night, say that Henry had a naturalist's mind and perhaps should be encouraged toward it. Henry, who was 9 now and approaching 10, with the increasing confidence of someone who has found what they're for, received this assessment with the contained pleasure of a boy who has been seen correctly. Eli could now read, not fluently, haltingly, with fierce concentration, sounding out the harder words with his tongue between his teeth, but he could do it. Evelyn had been working with him through the winter evenings, patient with the repetition in the way that patience isn't always available, but was, with him, because he was a child who rewarded patience by eventually just doing the thing. He read to her from the almanac one April evening, slowly, and when he reached the end of a full paragraph without stopping, he looked up with an expression of pure functional pride. "I read it," he said. "You did?" "The whole thing." "The whole paragraph, yes." He thought about this distinction. "I'll do the next one tomorrow," he said, with the deliberate ambition of someone setting a record. "Tomorrow," she agreed. These were not landmark moments. They were the ordinary kind. The kind that don't look significant when they're happening and only become visible in retrospect, when you can see the line they've been drawing the whole time. Caleb asked her to stay, really asked, in the way the question needed to be asked, on an evening in April, when the first warm day of the season had given way to a cool night and the sitting room had the fire going for what felt like one of the last times before summer changed the house's habits. He'd been working up to something for a few days. She'd noticed it in the slightly more direct way he'd been looking at her during meals, the way he'd paused in conversations, and then continued without saying the thing he'd paused for. She waited. She had learned to wait with him. He came to the sitting room after the children were in bed. He sat in his chair. She was reading. He said, "Put the book down." She put it down. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it right, which means I've been trying to figure out what right looks like for a couple of weeks." She said nothing. Let him continue. "You came here on an arrangement," he said, "a practical one, and you knew that going in, and I knew it, and we were both honest about it. I don't want to change the terms without your agreement." He was looking at the fire. "What I mean is, what's grown out of it? The last 4 months? I'm not assuming that's the same for you as it is for me, but it's there. For me. And I'd rather say it than not say it and have you not know." She looked at him. He was not a man who found this easy. The direct statement of the interior thing. She could see the effort it had cost him, the slight tension in his jaw, the particular set of his shoulders when he was making himself do something he'd rather not do. She'd learned to read that particular discomfort in him, and had come, quietly, to regard it as one of the more trustworthy things about him. He didn't say things easily, which meant when he said them, they were real. "I know it's there," she said. "For me too." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to make a declaration," she said. "I'm saying I'm not here because I have no other options. I've been other places in my life, other arrangements. I know the difference between staying because you must and staying because you found the place you're supposed to be." She held his gaze. "This is the second kind." He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not easy to be with," he said. I don't open up fast. I keep things." "I know. And you don't mind that." "I'm not looking for someone to perform feeling at me," she said. "I'm looking for someone who means it when it comes. You mean it." She paused. "I mind when you close me out without explanation. I don't mind the quiet." He looked at her with the expression she'd first seen on a November night, looking at his daughter through a window, and identified as a man who was encountering something he'd stopped expecting. "You're going to tell me when I close you out." "I already have. Twice." "I know." The corner of his mouth moved. "You were right both times." "I know I was." That almost smile became an actual one, brief, real, a thing that didn't stay on his face long enough to be performed. He reached across the space between their chairs, and she took his hand, and they held that for a moment in the quiet room with the fire burning low. "Stay," he said. "Not please stay, and not I want you to stay. Just stay, flat and simple, the way he said things that mattered most to him." "I'm staying," she said. "I've been staying. I'm going to keep staying." He squeezed her hand once, and then let go, and they went back to the comfortable quiet of the room, and it was not a perfect resolution because nothing about this was perfect. It was two people who had come to it circuitously, carrying their old damage, making their adjustments, finding the shape of something real in the space between two chairs on an April night. That was enough. More than enough. By summer, the ranch looked different. Not unrecognizably so. It was still the same land, the same buildings, the same 11 horses that Rosie could name in her sleep. But the fence lines were sound, all of them. The kitchen garden was the most productive it had been in years. Henry's beetle notebook had 46 entries. The road to the schoolhouse no longer flooded. Nora was preparing for her teaching examination with the focused intensity she brought to everything she decided to do. Frances Cook tutored her on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and Nora came home from those sessions with the slightly dazed look of someone who is being stretched in a direction they want to go. The examination was set for October, and Gerald Cook had quietly told Ruth Daly that in his considered opinion, the girl would pass it the first time. Thomas had started helping Caleb with the ranch's accounts, not just running errands, but actually understanding the numbers. Caleb had begun explaining the decisions behind them, which was a different thing from just inheriting them, and Thomas absorbed this with the thoughtful attention of someone being trained rather than just used. He was 15 and had his father's particular quality of unhurried thoroughness. He would be a good rancher or a good businessman, or a good something. The form it took didn't matter much yet. What mattered was that he was being given the chance to figure it out. On a morning in late June, Evelyn stood at the edge of the kitchen garden and looked at the row of tomato plants that had come in stronger than last year, the bean poles with their green tendrils finding the twine she'd strung for them, the yellow squash moving along the ground with the cheerful indifference of a plant that has found good soil and intends to use it. Behind her, she could hear the house, Eli's voice from somewhere upstairs, a door, Mabel's particular footstep in the kitchen, the sound of Rosie talking to one of the horses over the pasture fence. These sounds had become so familiar that they existed below conscious notice, the way a river exists below notice for people who live near it. You stop hearing it as sound and start hearing it as the texture of the place itself. She thought about the woman who had stood at the gate last October with 2 bags and the carefully managed expectation of nothing. She thought about the train and the gap in the window and the dark glass and the reflection she'd looked at and thought, this is what you chose. She had chosen it not knowing what it was, only knowing that the alternative, the slow, diminishing life she'd been living, was worse than the uncertainty of something new. She had not expected love. She had not expected Eli's hand finding her forehead in the dark. She had not expected Nora's voice in a hallway saying, I think it's supposed to be okay. She had not expected to pin a beetle drawing to a kitchen wall and feel, in that small act, something that she could only call being seen. She had not expected to matter to people the way she mattered to these people. Not because she was remarkable. She wasn't particularly. She was practical and stubborn and tired in the ways that people who have lost things are tired. She made mistakes. She oversalted the soup. She pushed when she should have waited when she should have pushed, miscalculated Nora's sensitivities and Caleb's silences, and the particular logic of a household that had been running on grief and necessity for 2 years before she arrived. None of it had been smooth. None of it had been a story you'd tell to make it sound easy. But she'd stayed. Through the resistance and the discomfort and the particular loneliness of being a stranger in someone else's established world, she'd stayed. And staying, she'd learned, was the thing. Not the grand gesture, not the single moment of heroism, though that had come too, on a fever night in December that she would not forget. The staying was the work, ordinary, cumulative, unspectacular. The kind of work that doesn't look like anything when you're doing it and looks like everything when you can finally see what it built. There is something this world gets wrong about belonging. It tells you that belonging is something you're granted, by a place, by a people, by the right circumstances aligning. It makes you think you have to be chosen before you can be home. But Evelyn Harper had been chosen before, in the life before this one, and the choosing had not been enough on its own. Being wanted is not the same as being part of something. Being welcomed is not the same as mattering. What she'd learned, slowly, expensively, across 4 seasons in a hard and beautiful place, was that belonging is made. You make it the way you make bread, imperfect, subject to the variables of the day, not always successful, but if you do the work consistently, the result feeds people. You make it by learning where the yarrow is, by sitting in the hard chair beside a sick child through the night, by not leaving when leaving would have been the easier choice. You make it, and then one morning you are standing in a kitchen garden listening to the sounds of the house, and you realize the house is listening back. Caleb found her at the garden fence later that morning. He'd been to the north pasture and came back with the particular look of a man who has been thinking during physical work and has arrived at a conclusion. He stopped beside her. He looked at the tomatoes. "They're coming in," he said. "Strong year for them," she agreed. They stood together at the fence in the summer light. The horses moved in the distance. Somewhere behind them, Eli had made it downstairs and was engaged in some enterprise that involved, from the sound of it, the participation of both Rosie and a bucket. "The county commissioner's dinner is in September," Caleb said. Daly mentioned it. He thought we should go. "He's right," Evelyn said. "We should. You'll want to write something up about the North Road drainage while we're at it. The section past the Brandt property still floods in the fall." She looked at him. "I hadn't gotten to that yet." "I noticed it last October. Figured you'd get there." She looked back at the garden. The morning light sat on the tomato leaves the way morning light does when the season is right. Particular, specific, the kind of light that belongs to the hour and won't be available again until tomorrow. "I'll start drafting something this week," she said. "Good." He put his hand briefly on the fence post beside her hand. The gesture was nothing, and it was not nothing. "Mabel's doing something complicated in the kitchen. She sent me out here. She does that when she's working on something that requires concentration." 30 years I've known that woman, he said. Never understood it until now. They walked back toward the house together, across the yard where the grass was growing green and the fence lines were sound, and the horses moved in the sun. Through the kitchen window, she could see Mabel's outline at the stove. Above the kitchen table, if you knew to look, there was a pencil drawing of a beetle with 4 parts labeled. And beside it, a small paper map of the northeastern corner of the property, pinned where they would stay. The house held all of them, all 9 of them, imperfect and ongoing and real. The grief was still there, in the way that grief doesn't leave but changes shape. Margaret Thornton was in the specific love her children carried for each other, in the competence Nora had built from necessity, in the way Caleb sat with his head bowed against his youngest sons and closed his eyes. She was part of the house's structure and would stay part of it. Evelyn did not wish otherwise. What she was, what she had built herself into, one difficult ordinary day at a time, was something else. Not replacement. Not the woman who came after. She was the woman who stayed. The woman who learned where the yarrow was. The woman who wrote the letter, fixed the fence, made the bread, told the stories. The woman who found, in the business of making herself useful to people who needed her, that she had also made herself home. The door closed behind them. Inside, the house was warm and busy and imperfect in all the ways that a house full of living people is always imperfect. And outside, the frontier summer continued, wide and indifferent and beautiful, going on in every direction, the way it always had, the way it would long after all of them were gone. That was the world. That was what you worked within, and if you were lucky, and if you stayed, it was enough.